Real boss you ever saw.
To a potential threat using distance, cover, or concealment, right? So hiding, say, behind a squad car, right?
Yes.
Avoiding physical confrontation. That's probably a pretty big one, right?
Yes.
And using verbal techniques to calm an agitated subject or promote rational decision making. That's kind of down towards the end.
Yes.
And lastly, calling additional resources. Right?
Yes.
We talked about $230. Showing you Exhibit 230, which is the emergency medical response. You'd agree that the policy requires Minneapolis police employees to request an emergency medical service as soon as practical, right?
Yes.
If a person comes into contact having an acute medical crisis, any delay in treatment could potentially aggravate the severity of the medical crisis, right?
Yes.
So sometimes officers will call for EMS, not thinking it's a major issue. When somebody becomes apparent, they can step up or request a quicker response from EMS, right?
Yes.
And that is something that an officer can do to ensure the medical treatment of the suspect that they have or the person that they're in contact with, right?
Counselor, to ensure.
Sorry, it's been a long week. To ensure the medical condition of the suspect, to help with that.
Yes.
Right. Get EMS there as quickly as is possible. Right?
Yes.
Now we didn't talk about the maximal restraint technique. You're familiar with the policy surrounding that?
Yes.
I'm going to show you what's been admitted as Exhibit 225. Can you describe what a maximal restraint technique is?
Yes, Counselor, the maximal restraint technique has often been referred to as the hobble. And that is it's a method of if officers are dealing with typically a combative or aggressive person, in order to protect them or even property, it's placing, basically attaching a cord of the legs to the waist, so that the person, the individual, does not have free movement of their legs. So it's securing them, again, usually by their ankles. If you're prone, bringing that up to your waist and securing it. The maximal restraint technique, or the hobble, though, if it's used, a supervisor has to respond to the scene. You cannot transport anyone prone in that position due to the risk of the breathing. But that is Counselor, that would be my understanding of the MRT, or the maximal restraint technique.
And their use of force from time to time, right? They
Yes.
should be, at least, right? And so if officers decide to use the maximal restraint technique and then decide, hey, we know, and then later decide not to use it, that is kind of adjusting that use of force.
I would, Counselor, with some clarity, I don't know if that, what I mean by that is, if you were to have a person handcuffed and prone on their stomach on the ground and pavement, and you had two officers, let's say, securing their legs to the back of the waist, you in a way are still employing what that technique is about anyway. So, so that there can be some variances to that.
Sure.
If that makes sense.
It does. So let's assume that you've got two officers pulling the legs forward, essentially employing that aversion, so to speak, of the maximal restraint. But then they release and they say, we're not gonna hold this person. We're not gonna employ the MRT. You're going from a decision to employ that technique backwards down the continuum in terms of the use of force. Would you agree with that?
And Counselor, just because these types of uses of force can be problematic in terms of there's a high risk to them. So meaning that if you're going to take that initiative to do that alternative version in the first place, you'd want to get a hold of a supervisor because something could happen in terms of that person. And so
I'm not asking in terms of the policy. I'm asking in terms of sort of the use of force and the critical decision-making model, right? You described how the use of force, you have to go through this critical decision-making model. How much force am I going to use? And sometimes you have to back off the use of force. Agreed?
Yes.
And sometimes you have to go forward with the use of force, meaning you use even more force.
Yes.
Right? And it's this constant reevaluation. Agreed?
Yes.
And so when you have officers who make a decision that the facts and circumstances would warrant using the hobble device, but then later decide not to employ that device, that is that critical decision-making model in action. Agreed?
Yes.
And it would be a reduction in the use of force. It may still require supervisors to be on scene, policy-wise, but it is a reduction in the use of force. Agreed?
And Counselor, are we talking specifically the events of May 25th?
I'm talking generally.
In general, yes.
But you would agree, ultimately, that all of the Minneapolis Police Department policies relevant to the use of force, emergency medical response, emergency medical treatment, all of these policies are, by their very language, are situationally dependent, right? They all say, if the circumstances allow, if time permits, if it's safe. They have a qualifier to them. Agreed?
Yes, I'd agree with that.
That bothered me. Also, another thing that really stuck out was that
if the circumstances allow, if time permits, if it's safe, they have a qualifier to them. Agreed?
Yes, I'd agree with that.
I'll show you Exhibit 231. Which is at the bottom of Exhibit 231 is the crisis intervention policy. And the second page includes the definition. Could you read the entire definition of what a crisis is?
Yes. An event or situation where an individual's safety and health are threatened by behavioral health challenges to include mental illness, developmental disabilities, substance use, or overwhelming stressors. A crisis can involve an individual's perception or experience of an event or situation as an intolerable difficulty that exceeds the individual's current resources and coping mechanisms and may include unusual stress in his or her life that renders him or her unable to function as he or she normally would. The crisis may, but not necessarily, result in an upward trajectory or intensity culminating in thoughts or acts that are possibly dangerous to himself, herself, and or others.
All right. So generally speaking, again, not relevant to the May 25th of 2020 incident. We'll get there in a minute. But when we talk about a general police response, sometimes the police may respond to something and the person they're dealing with is not in a crisis. Agreed?
Yes.
But other people may be perceiving what is happening and it could become a crisis to that person.
Could you? If you could rephrase.
Sure. People who observe, would you say that people who observe police interactions with people, especially the more physical or use of force types, that could turn into a crisis for an observer?
Sustainer is calling for speculation.
So in terms of the definition of crisis, a crisis may involve an individual's perception or experience of an event or situation as an intolerable difficulty that exceeds that individual's current resources and coping mechanisms, right?
Yes.
That doesn't necessarily mean that you are the person with whom you are arresting or having contact with is going to be the person who will experience the crisis. Agreed?
Overruled.
And Counselor, just respectfully, so you're saying that the person who's witnessing a situation with the officers, that situation may cause them to be in crisis?
Correct.
Could potentially.
Right. And the crisis may, but not necessarily, result in an upward trajectory or intensity culminating in thoughts or acts that are possibly dangerous to him, her, or others. Right?
And Counselor, just this is the person who's watching this?
Right.
It could.
So people are watching what something that they appear to believe or they believe is wrong or contrary to police policy that may cause them to get upset, and that level of upsetment or that level of volatility may grow throughout the course of the interaction.
Objection, irrelevant, calls for speculation and beyond the scope.
Overruled. It's within the scope.
It could.
Because ultimately, part of the training that Minneapolis police officers have to go through is how to deal with crowds who observe police interactions, right?
Yes.
Crowds that may be upset with police interaction, right?
Yes.
I mean, there are classes through the... And all of this is to revert, in part, back to that de-escalation process as well, right?
Yes.
So part of it, as a crowd grows or becomes more upset, part of it is to try to de-escalate, which can involve trying to avoid a physical confrontation, right?
Yes, it could. Yes.
Trying to stay safe, concealed, and covered, right?
Yes.
Not yelling back at somebody, not engaging with them verbally, right?
Yes.
And sometimes when an officer tries to de-escalate a situation and someone is so upset, right? Sometimes they don't hear what the officer tells them. Would you agree with that?
Objection, speculation.
That calls for speculation. It is sustained.
Is it possible, generally speaking, that someone's own crisis may prevent them from hearing what an officer is telling them?
That could happen.
Hold on. The objection is sustained. The answer will be stricken.
So you testified that you've watched the body cameras, correct?
Yes.
What's that place that sells?
Each resident is important.
Perfectly. And so at this point, I think
Mr. Slisher, this is Exhibit 1008, which is a 10-second, approximately 5-second clip of Alexander King's body-worn camera. It's already in. I gave you a copy of it. Not yet, no. I'm just telling you first and foremost that's what it is. I'm going to show you on your screen a short clip of a video to see if this would be contained in what you've watched. And I need to... You would agree that that appears to be taken from one of the officer's body cameras, May 25th, 2020, at approximately 20:25 and 33 seconds.
Yes.
In, again, watching it without sound. Do you, at this point, did you see what appeared to be someone's reflection in the back of the squad car there?
Counselor, I did not.
Okay.
And it might just be because of the brevity of the video, but
Yeah, it's unfortunate. If you look in the upper left-hand corner at the bumper of the squad video,
The cursor to circle it for him.
I'm sorry?
Use the cursor, the stylus to...
Oh, sure. Forgot all this fancy technology here.
Texas, who has opted not to throw out the first pitch here. We're going to get into
From one of the officer's body-worn cameras on May 25th of 2020.
yes.
You've seen these before. You see what appears to be Mr. Floyd's arm there by the back of the squad car, right?
Yes.
So I would offer Exhibit 1008.
Any objection?
No objection.
1008 is received.
And if I may publish.
come over here. Off of the sidewalk.
Yeah, we need to do some distance. Do you hear a voice say we've got an ambulance coming?
Yes.
Oops, sorry, we can take that down. Now, policy 5-311. Let's talk a little bit about 5-311, which is the neck restraint policy.
Second?
He was not going to do that because of the ML.
Good time to break for our 20-minute mid-afternoon break. We'll reconvene around 3:20. Thank you.
To the lead, I'm Jake Tapper, and the courtroom just broke there. You saw we are starting with our breaking news in our national lead today, and the very closely watched trial in Minnesota. Just moments ago, you heard the Minneapolis police chief testify against his own former officer, Derek Chauvin, who is, of course, charged with murdering George Floyd last May. Police Chief Madera Arredondo said Chauvin did not use a reasonable amount of force when restraining Mr. Floyd, and that his actions went against police training. The chief also testified that Officer Chauvin violated department policy multiple times, including by not de-escalating the situation and by failing to render medical aid to Mr. Floyd. This is the same chief who fired Chauvin last year, calling what happened to George Floyd murder. Let's get right to CNN's Omar Jimenez. He's in Minneapolis covering the trial for us. And Omar, explain what we just saw and heard from the police chief.
Yeah, Jake, so this is really the start of week 2 of testimony here in this trial, and this was a highly anticipated witness here, the current Minneapolis police chief, Madera Arredondo, testifying in the trial of Derek Chauvin, his former officer, and the most critical part of testimony was when he was asked if he had a belief or an opinion on when the action Chauvin took on May 25th, 2020 should have stopped. And critically, he said, once there was no longer any resistance, and clearly when Floyd was no longer responsive, to apply that level of force to a person prone handcuffed behind his back is not part of policy training and not part of the ethics or values of being a Minneapolis police officer. And we had clues as to what he was going to say based on prior messaging that he had put out. He released a letter in the weeks after firing these officers, of course, within 48 hours of this happening, calling what happened murder. And then when you come to opening statements of this trial, the prosecutors had said that the chief was going to testify this was not part of police policy, and specifically they asked the chief, is this a trained department tactic? And he definitively said it is not. And this also gives the start of what we are going to see over the course of this week. Last week was primarily focusing on establishing what happened on May 25th. This week we'll be trying to prove that case of what Derek Chauvin has pleaded not guilty to, the murder and manslaughter charges. We're going to see that move forward with the use of force, dialing in on whether that was necessary and what happened there. We've seen it with the chief now, and later on we're going to see it from the commander who heads all of the training for Minneapolis Police Department.
All right, Omar Jimenez, thank you so much.
That is correct.
And how did you serve as a sergeant when you were first promoted?
I served as a investigator with the property crimes unit at that time.
How many people approximately did you supervise?
At that time, I did not supervise any. I worked as a detective or investigator alongside other detectives.
Okay. How long did you hold that position?
Approximately 2 years.
Is going that Texas would try and implement this. It's an outdoor stadium. They're going to be wearing masks, but for eating and drinking. And the gentleman had the soundbite about the hot dog. I was certainly jealous of that.
Based on the information I had, it was more likely than the other possibilities.
And doctor, is there another name for death by oxygen deficiency?
Asphyxia.
Let's bring into our conversation, as we do every day around this time, NBC News correspondent Shaquille Brewster live for us in Minneapolis. Also joining us, former U.S. Attorney and an MSNBC contributor, Joyce Vance, and Carmen Beck. To this story, they're using that Supreme Court case to show that there's more than what the prosecution had referred to. There are split-second decisions that the police officer has to do. And also, what is interesting, some of the things that he is asking him about escalating to de-escalate, the use of force can be used to then de-escalate. He has to say, I really think you need to talk to the trainers on that. He's not able to answer the questions.
Interesting. All right, we'll get the take of the rest of our panel coming up. And again, the chief will be back on the stand here about 15 minutes from now. You're not going to miss a moment. You're watching HLN's continuing coverage of the Derek Chauvin trial. Stay with us.
The arguments that we heard before court even started this morning, or before testimony even started this morning, we got a hint that the prosecution is planning to call several of these officers, these trainers, to talk about the use of force. You heard the police chief there make very clear that he believes that Chauvin's use of force was excessive. And I think it's worth repeating. He said when Mr. Floyd is no longer responsive, even motionless, to continue to apply that level of force to someone who's in that prone and handcuffed position, he said that's not part of policy, and that's certainly not part of the ethics or values. Remember, this is the police chief that within hours of seeing that video fired Derek Chauvin and the 3 other officers on the scene. Important point about that. That is a point that the jury is not allowed to be aware of. They're not allowed to know about Derek Chauvin's employment status, just that it ended the day after that video. But this is a police chief that has spoke against Derek Chauvin and his actions before, very publicly. And it's one who has made part of his philosophy, and you got a hint of that in his testimony, part of his policing philosophy, moving from one of the warrior mentality to that of a guardian mentality. And you're seeing hints of that in his testimony today. He is not happy. He's made very clear he's not happy about what happened to George Floyd, and he's testifying specifically why that is and why he believes Derek Chauvin's actions on the 25th, captured on video, broke with department policy, Nicole.
Reporter talk to. How safe do you think it is in there?
I think it's going to be hard to keep transmission to 0 during a situation.
That was probably about 2 years as well.
Seeing a pattern here. What happened after that?
After that, I was appointed to the rank of commander.
And what does a commander do?
I want you to take a listen to what she had to say about the emotions that she and the community in Minneapolis, St. Paul are going through.
it's been, re-traumatizing. It's been really hard. I've tried to avoid watching. I know a lot of us here in Minneapolis have done that, but it's hard, right? You also want to know the details and want to hear from the witnesses.
Our own Nia Malika Henderson wrote a very powerful op-ed about how she's not watching the trial because it's triggering, to use a word. You've talked about the emotional stress of this trial on many Americans.
Position in charge of the downtown precinct or first precinct, and that was a patrol function, so that was mainly patrol-related functions, even though we do have great civilian teams who work on things.
Remember, flattening the curve is about preserving hospital capacity, and hospitals, by and large, across the country are in a much better place.
Very clearly, based on his work, based on his expertise, someone who saw George Floyd while he was officially still alive, though still pulseless and without a heartbeat, it's based on his expertise that he believes that it was asphyxiation that was the primary cause of death.
Joyce Vance, I'm reminded of something that you and Chuck Rosenberg have reminded us in many contexts, but especially when you're watching a jury trial, that at some point jurors will be asked not to abandon common sense. And if you build on the testimony from the law enforcement official who was Chauvin's supervisor, and now you've got the chief, there's no testimony that comes close to suggesting that anything Chauvin did was within department policy. Is that still what you think the defense is going to argue?
Well, we're still in the prosecution's case, so it's important to remember that we haven't heard the defense really try to make headway yet. We heard a little bit of in opening statements, but not much. The argument that's going on here is a question about whether or not the homicide was justified under police policy, and it also feeds into the prosecution's proof that at some point this officer went beyond doing his job and was reckless about the life of George Floyd and ended up taking his life. One of the things the prosecution will have to prove to sustain some of the charges. What the defense really is going to do, Nicole, and we can all see it coming, right? They're going to argue about cause of death. They're going to say it was drugs, it was something other than the very obvious knee on the neck, which, as you correctly point out, when the judge tells the jurors to use their common sense, it will be awfully difficult to ignore that knee when they're deliberating.
In terms of the deployment of your resources at the Minneapolis Police Department and as chief, how do you rate, I guess, the severity of that offense, the seriousness of that offense?
It would probably not rise to the level of, and particularly in light of the last year, the level of violent crime that we've experienced in the city, but we would certainly respond to it, but it would not rise to the level in terms of severity of the crime here.
That gets us back to how this all started. An alleged counterfeit $20 bill. The chief went on to say you wouldn't even take somebody into custody under normal circumstances for that. Let's get our expert panel back up again. This panel is the best in the business. Civil rights attorney, HLN legal analyst Areva Martin. Areva, give me your take on that point. That did a counterfeit 20 or an alleged counterfeit 20? Should that have led to all this?
Absolutely not, Mike, and we've heard that over and over again. We've heard that under the law in Minnesota that police officer, the police officers responding to that call from Cup Foods could have given Mr. Floyd a fine. They could have given a ticket, essentially, a citation that would have forced him to go into court and have this matter adjudicated before a judge. That, even arresting him for some was an act of force that wasn't necessary. I want to talk about, too, what we heard from that police officer. Obviously, he testified that Chauvin violated policy as it relates to the use of force. He violated policy as it relates to rendering aid. One thing, though, really concerned me about the testimony. So we have the police chief talking about the sanctity of life, respect, and how those are values that are so important to that police department. But yet we heard him say it took a community leader, a community person, to call him at 12 o'clock at night to tell him about the horrific incident involving Mr. Floyd, that no officer, no one in his own department, this is a department that values the sanctity of but yet no one told him that Chauvin had, kneeled on Mr. Floyd's neck for 9 minutes and 29 seconds. That tells us a great deal about how the policies are written and then how they're implemented in the Minneapolis Police Department.
No, that's it. And one of the points made 2 different times in testimony here is medical aid. That's part of your training. If someone that is in your custody, your care, and they're in medical distress, you provide aid. Let's listen to that, and we'll get your take coming out.
While awaiting EMS, MPD employees assisting an individual having an acute medical crisis shall provide any necessary first aid consistent with our MPD training as soon as practical.
And so then that presumes, of course, they're waiting for EMS or waiting for some kind of emergency services. Is that right?
That is correct.
So would it be fair to say that this policy then is in 2 parts? The officer has to request EMS or an ambulance, correct?
Yes.
And while waiting for the ambulance, they're required to provide what medical training and skills they have to attempt to save the person.
That is correct.
It was also noted in there that one of the officers, it was Officer King, could not find a pulse. Bob Bianchi joins us now. He's a former prosecutor, a criminal defense attorney. Bob, that no medical care, how big of a point was that?
It's a big point, but I think what the defense attorney is doing, Mike, look, as a prosecutor, I'm looking at, are they nicking my witnesses? Are they scoring points on the witnesses? And one of the good things the defendant did that would not make me happy when I went home as a prosecutor prosecuting this case is basically saying, so this is situational, yes. So it qualifies depending on the circumstances as they are unfolding, yes. And as soon as it's practicable can mean different things in different circumstances, in different scenarios. The fact of the matter is those policies don't tell you exactly point by point by point what to do, step by step by step. And it's that wiggle room, it's that discretion that the policies give where the defense wants to go.
Real quick, Misty, on that point, let's get back to the medical care. That Mr. Floyd, they couldn't find a pulse. Is there wiggle room in that point? Or is it cut and dry that he needed care?
Yeah, no, Mike, you make a great point. And I think what the defense attorney was doing right before the break when we saw that very small video, he made a point to say, did you hear the officer say we called an ambulance? So I think the defense is going to continue on that line of questioning and perhaps introduce more evidence that calling for emergency services would satisfy the requirements under the policy. That's just my foreshadowing based on what we've seen.
No, I agree with you. I think that is where he's going in the sense of the situation is more under control. EMS is on the way. We're doing all we can. I think that's where the defense is going to try and go with this. We're going to take a quick break. Again, the Chief's test will be back up with more testimony. You're not going to miss one.
To give him CPR, anyone who's been a lifeguard to earn money during the summers knows that CPR is something pretty basic. Surely every police officer knows how to do it, and no one sought to or thought to.
There was, in fact, testimony earlier in the trial that all of the officers are trained in CPR. So what we're learning about here, and remember, Nicole, the lawyers don't get to argue the evidence at this point. They're taking testimony. I think of it as they're sort of collecting jewels that they'll use in the end in closing argument to make their case. We don't really hear from them at this point what they think the significance is. But here we've got evidence from witness after witness about what didn't happen at the scene. Was there CPR? No. Did anyone think about using Narcan, a drug that can bring people back from an overdose at that point? No, that didn't happen, although we hear now that the defense might be overdose. And we hear from this doctor that he didn't use Narcan because cardiac arrest had been going on for too long. So we see these sorts of failures of care, which not only violate the police standards, according to Chief Arredondo, but also feed into what's being set up in the charges the prosecution has brought. Whether or not Chauvin created a dangerous situation and ignored the risk of death, whether he had what Minnesota law calls a depraved mind, whether he was callous and reckless with regard to the risk of death. And so these sorts of pieces of evidence will come into play in closing, and they will be powerful, even though they are not the opinion of the medical examiner. And we know that there's a battle ahead because the medical examiners do not agree on the cause of death here.
But it doesn't look like she's going to be going to the border. What do you think of that?
Geographic area of your jurisdiction?
Yes, it is.
And then can you just use 269 to describe the precincts and what they are and what purpose they serve?
Yes, this exhibit outlines the 5 geographical precincts, and this also.
I think it would look like more cases, perhaps more hospitalizations, but I don't think you'll see an increase in deaths. That's basically Michigan's story right now. You see a dramatic increase in cases in Michigan, but not deaths in Michigan. And I think that's because, as you know it, about 55%
disclosures for investors. You know, as you know, the SEC is a disclosure regulator, and so one of the most
given the fact that there are these variants spreading.
Right, and we're not there yet. I mean, we're going to need to get to about 80 or 85% population immunity, either from natural infection or immunization, before people can, in any sense, I think, feel relaxed. And you're right, the variants, I think this vaccine right now, these vaccines will protect against severe critical disease caused by the variants, but, you know, may not protect against mild or moderate disease that's been shown in some studies.
And what can you tell us about this new variant strain first identified in India? It's been reported in California. What do we know about it?
Right, so it does look like it has the kind of mutations that put it into the variant of concern category, like the South African strain, the Brazilian strain, the New York strain. I mean, to date, we don't know that these variants have completely escaped immunity, where, for example, if you've been naturally infected or immunized, you still may be hospitalized or be in an ICU or die. That hasn't happened yet, so we haven't crossed that line yet.
All right, Dr. Paul Offit, always good to see you. Thank you so much. And
on the 3rd precinct, oh, it's a little hard to see, but you can see the, that's much better.
Those who are coming in are not from Mexico, they're not even South America, some have been picked up from Africa, what have you. What is really going on?
Well, it's incentivized magnets. I mean, the incentives that come here, you know, with a zero border and coming here with the promise of benefits here, is a magnet you've got to turn off. Listen, we've got to balance the safety and security of our nation. It's a national border with Mexico. I mean, this is a DHS issue. Department of Homeland Security. And its most basic, fundamental situation that we have in here is to take care of your border and your people. You can be as welcome as you want, and we are a welcoming country. That's $1 million a year on legal immigration under an orderly, standardized process that works very, very well, as we've seen in the last 2 years. This is in so many ways.
One of them had their eyes on Chief Arredondo as he was explaining that and explaining the hobble technique and the different techniques that the training allows for, but that he's testifying that Derek Chauvin did not follow. So that is a key thing here. We heard that from the bystanders who were begging and pleading with officers, and now you hear from police leadership themselves.
And the off-duty EMT, it is definitely a consistent story that the prosecution is putting forward to the jury so far. Let's go back in.
Police policy 5-311, correct?
Yes.
Exhibit 224. Chokehold and a neck restraint, correct?
Yes.
A chokehold is actually from the front obstructing or occluding the trachea and airway of the suspect, correct?
Yes.
And per Minneapolis policy, that's considered a lethal use of force or a deadly use of force, right?
Yes.
And that's because it has a high rate of death associated with it, right?
That is correct.
It's more dangerous from the front.
Yes.
It also differentiates between a chokehold and a neck restraint. Agreed?
Yes.
And a neck restraint is specifically defined as compressing one or both sides of a person's neck with an arm or leg without applying direct pressure to the trachea or airway. Agreed?
Based upon the policy, I think it's important to note, Counselor, that the light to moderate pressure.
Right. Understood. Light to moderate pressure. Yes. And I'm assuming that you don't have a degree in physics.
I do not, Counselor.
Okay. And in terms of the amount of pressure or force that was actually applied to Mr. Floyd, you would not be qualified to speak to that. Agreed?
Agreed.
But then it also differentiates between a conscious and an unconscious neck restraint, right?
Yes.
And a conscious neck restraint is where you have someone who is resisting you and you apply that neck restraint in an effort to simply gain control of that person, but they stay conscious, correct?
Yes.
And an unconscious neck restraint is where you actually render the subject unconscious, right?
Yes.
Both were permitted under Minneapolis police policy on May 25th, 2020. Agreed?
Yes.
And ultimately, you have, if I understand what you have, the opinion that you have formed the opinion that this was a neck restraint that was being employed.
Yes.
And you have also formed you're familiar, you testified on direct examination that it is contrary to the training that you've received to place your neck or your knee on a subject's neck.
Counselor, if I can clarify, it is contrary to our training to indefinitely place your knee on a prone, handcuffed individual for an indefinite period of time.
So the issue that you take with it is the length of time?
Counselor, there's a couple of issues, and one of those, again, is, as you noted, receiving the information. Is the person a threat to the officers or others? What is the severity of the crime? Are you reevaluating and assessing the person's medical condition? So all of that critical thinking, that's really key for me in terms of why I vehemently disagree that that was the appropriate use of force for that situation on May 25th.
Now, when we talk about that critical decision-making model, that critical decision-making model doesn't only apply to the specific subject that you have under your control, correct?
And Counselor, so we're talking about the bystanders?
Would you mind moving the microphone back just a little?
Your Honor, my apologies.
No problem.
I think we just got a loud voice. Well, I'm talking about bystanders. I'm talking about other officers. I'm talking about other things that come into play in terms of the officer's critical decision making.
And I apologize, Counselor, if you could just rephrase that question again.
When an officer is engaged in the use of force, and I'll just phrase it as a yes or no, their attention is not exclusively necessarily focused on the subject of whom they have in custody. Agreed or disagree?
Counselor, the officer that is engaging in the use of force may be viewing other matters?
Correct.
That would be yes.
Right, and in fact, that's what the de-escalation model talks about, is looking at things from a tactical advantage or disadvantage. Agreed?
That's one of the portions of it.
Right. Specifically in the policy, de-escalation has to be applied, assuming that it's safe to do so, right?
Yes.
And all other tactical considerations. Agreed? That's what the policy says.
Yes.
And in terms of those decision-making, an officer, it's not a singular decision-making process that's happening in the course of an arrest. Agreed?
Yes.
So an officer has to be concerned about other things that are known to him at that time. Agreed?
Yes.
So some of those things would be, what just happened between me and this subject a few minutes ago, right?
Yes.
I just fought with this subject a few minutes ago. I'm talking generally here. I just fought with this person generally a few minutes ago. He now seems to be not resisting, but that doesn't mean he can't resist again, right?
Yes.
Even if he's handcuffed, right?
Yes.
And so even if he's handcuffed, someone could still, they're not threatless if they're handcuffed. Agreed?
And Counselor, this is just a general hypothetical.
Right.
Yes.
Right. Someone who is handcuffed can be equally as a threat to an officer as someone who's not handcuffed.
Yes.
They can kick, and they can bite, they can spit, they can do all sorts of things. Agreed?
Yes.
Now, in terms of the use, so I just want to make sure you form the opinion that this was a unconscious neck restraint, right?
Counselor?
On May 25th of 2020.
That it was a conscious neck restraint.
Conscious neck restraint.
Yes.
Okay. Now, again, in this whole de-escalation, officers have to take into consideration the safety of the crowd, right?
Yes.
They have to take into account the reactions of the crowd, whether they're angry or hostile or just simply watching, right?
Yes.
That's all a part of this critical decision-making, right?
Yes.
They have to be aware of their surroundings.
Reach as she is addressing the opening session for the World Bank.
Simply watching, right?
Yes.
That's all a part of this critical decision-making, right?
Yes.
They have to be aware of their surroundings, right? Generally speaking. Being on a busy street versus being in a park, right?
Yes.
Different decision go into that, right?
Yes.
Knowing that I have other officers that are in place and may be at risk as well, right?
Yes.
So there's lots of, the critical decision-making model is not singular in its application.
That's correct.
Lots of information coming in very rapidly, right?
Yes.
So I'm going to show you first, and I believe by stipulation, or at least without objection, I'm going to play a few minutes, or excuse me, a few seconds of Ms. Frazier's Facebook video. So at this time, I'd offer Exhibit 1018.
No.
Permission to publish.
1018 is received. You may publish.
I'm going to pause it here, sorry. This appears to be sort of that time, that picture that was shown to you earlier, Exhibit 19. This is that general time frame that picture appears to be taken from.
Counselor, yes. I'm sorry. Was that that's the question? Sorry.
Oh, yeah. This appears to be that image you were shown on direct examination, that static Exhibit 19, right?
Yes.
Shows Officer Chauvin, shows Mr. Floyd, it shows Officer Top.
Yes.
And it shows the perspective of the Ms. Frazier's phone. Chief, are you familiar with the concept of camera perspective bias?
I am not, Counselor.
Okay. Now again, if I may take that down, a stipulation, I'm going to show that same time frame, Exhibit 1019, that same perspective from Mr. King's body camera. And I'd offer 1019. 1019.
Any objection? 1019 is received.
Wish to publish, Your Honor. Agree it appears to be the same time frame?
Yes.
All right. Now, lastly, Chief, I'm going to show you one last video. Of the two.
Any objection?
No objection.
1020 is received.
And permission to publish. Pardon? Oh. It just started over. That's okay. You would agree, Chief, that from the perspective of Miss Frazier's camera, it appears that Officer Chauvin's knee is on the neck of Mr. Floyd.
Yes.
Sorry, I didn't want to do that. Would you agree that from the perspective of Officer King's body camera, it appears that Officer Chauvin's knee was more on Mr. Floyd's shoulder blade?
Yes.
I have no further questions.
Mr. Slusher.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Pay for what you need.
Liberty, 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 liberty. Officer King, or former Officer King's body-worn camera, it appeared at that moment in time that the knee of the defendant was more toward the shoulder blade. Is that right?
That is correct.
That was at a time where the ambulance had already arrived?
Yes.
Very shortly before they loaded Mr. Floyd onto the gurney?
That is correct.
And in your view of the body-worn camera footage, everything you reviewed prior to testifying today, did you see the defendant's knee anywhere but the neck of Mr. Floyd up until that time?
That is correct.
And so the knee of the defendant was on Mr. Floyd's neck up until the time you just pointed out?
Yes. When I viewed that video portion, that is the first time that I'd seen the knee of the defendant on the shoulder blade area.
And that was right before the paramedic came?
That is correct.
Now, looking at and talking about the neck restraint policy, if you'd show Exhibit 17, please. Oh. Looking at Exhibit 17, was it your testimony that Exhibit 17 is not a trained MPD neck restraint?
Correct, that is my testimony.
And I'd like you to reflect on the exhibits that you were shown by defense counsel, Exhibits 1008, 1019, and 1020, the 10-second clip. Okay. During that period of time, which is much later than the point in time we see here, did you see any indication that Mr. Floyd was actively resisting, as that term is defined in Minneapolis Police Department policy?
I did not observe Mr. Floyd to be actively resisting during that time.
Did you see, same question, same time period, any indication that Mr. Floyd was being actively aggressive during that 10-second clip that you were just showing?
No, I did not observe Mr. Floyd to be actively aggressive during that short video.
Could you even say that he was passively resisting at that time that you were showing those exhibits?
No. As a matter of fact, as I saw that video, I didn't even know if Mr. Floyd was alive at that time.
Keep that down, please. I want to revisit a little bit of the testimony on cross-examination about the use of the MRT or the hobble, right? And if I'm to understand your testimony, you indicated that a hobble is a strap that's used to connect a handcuffed person, their waist, the arms, and the legs to restrain them. Is that right?
Yes, that is correct.
And what I thought I heard you saying in response to questioning by counsel was that you can do an MRT effectively, right, without using a hobble when you're doing the same thing but with your hands.
Yes, that is correct.
And did I understand your testimony to essentially be that that's what these officers were doing, was essentially using the maximal restraint technique but not using the hobble?
That is correct.
And pursuant to departmental policy, the hobble is the only authorized way to employ the maximal restraint technique. Is that right?
That is correct.
You aware that the use of the actual hobble requires a supervisor to report to the scene and do a force report?
Yes, the supervisor must arrive at the scene and do a report.
But that would be avoided if the hobble itself wasn't used, or?
No, if you're still employing that sort of technique, again, with a prone individual handcuffed, and you're basically doing that maneuver, and because of the severity of risk to, and certainly that would have been to Mr. Floyd, you would have contacted the supervisor.
And aside from that, I mean, if you're using an MRT, you are supposed to adhere to departmental policy. Is that right?
That is correct.
And the Minneapolis departmental policy for the use of the MRT requires an officer to do what as soon as the MRT is applied?
Again, because of the severe nature of making sure that that individual can breathe, we have to get that individual into a side recovery position to make sure that their airway is not obstructed. And so that's paramount.
So, and that's required by policy, and the side recovery position is supposed to be instant. Is that right?
Immediate.
And you indicated that it has to do with breathing. You're familiar with the term positional asphyxia?
I am.
Is that one of the dangers of leaving somebody in a prone, handcuffed position for too long?
Yes, position.
The term positional asphyxia?
I am.
Is that one of the dangers of leaving somebody in a prone, handcuffed position for too long?
Yes, positional asphyxia. We again, as I mentioned, we cannot transport people in that position if they're prone to handcuffed and there's pressure around their airways or on their back. The risk and potential for them and us killing them goes up substantially. So that side recovery position is very critically important.
I want to follow up on some of the questions about your own personal training and that of different officers in different roles within the Minneapolis Police Department. Different officers can attend other types of training. Is that right?
Yes.
But everybody's required to do in-service training. Is that true?
That is correct.
And regardless of where somebody trains, I mean, the rules are the rules, right?
Yes.
And the policy applies to all MPD officers.
Yes.
Question was posed regarding the critical decision-making model and the need to take in information. And that's true, correct?
Yes.
But when we're looking at the proper and authorized use of force under departmental policy, is it fair to say that the amount of force an officer can use depends upon the conduct of the subject, the person upon whom the force is being used?
Yes, it's fair to say that.
So, for example, if you had me in, let's say, a dangerous hold, okay, would you be able to continue to keep me in a dangerous hold based on something somebody else is doing?
Yeah, I'm sorry. If you could explain that, I'm sorry.
So, for example, if you found the need to place me in some sort of a hold that's dangerous,
yes,
but something that you see, say the judge is starting to pick something up to throw at me, would that justify you using more force on me?
No.
And in terms of de-escalating the crowd, you indicated that there's some potential need to de-escalate a crowd, a group of people. Is that right?
Yes.
Because a group of people can experience something that they find shocking or upsetting, and that can, place them in some kind of an emotional state. Is that right?
That is correct.
And you may need to turn your attention to and de-escalate the crowd.
Yes.
Would one way, if we can show Exhibit 17, would one way to de-escalate the crowd who's experiencing something shocking to stop doing the thing that's shocking them?
Absolutely.
I have nothing further.
Any recross?
And to allow for another round of elections sometime in either the next year or
Best way to move forward. Agreed?
Agreed.
Sometimes you just have to kind of hold the person, correct?
Yes.
And that's something that happens fairly frequently. Agreed?
Yes.
And so one other question with respect to the policy regarding the maximal restraint technique and putting a person in the recovery position or the side recovery position, you said it was immediate. Agreed?
As soon as you're able to do so, yes.
Right. And that's actually what the policy says, is as soon as you're able to do so, right?
Yes.
And there are certain circumstances under which you may be using force where the force has to be dealt with before you can turn your attention to rendering medical aid, right?
And counsel, just so that, are we still talking about someone in the recovery position or the hollow?
Just generally.
Can you repeat that? I'm sorry.
Sure. There are certain circumstances where a use of force needs to be continued for some reason to deal with something else before you can deal or render medical aid. Let me give you an example.
Yeah.
We're in a gun battle, right? You and I are shooting at each other. I'm the cop, you're the bad guy, and you hit my partner. I'm going to continue to use my force against you before I can go render medical aid.
Counselor, in that hypothetical, yes.
Thank you.
Briefly.
Sometimes it's necessary to freeze a scene and to hold an individual, correct?
Yes.
But you have to do so safely. You have to hold the person safely. Isn't that correct?
That is correct.
Nothing further.
All right, thank you, Chief.
Your Honor, thank you so much.
Next witness. All right.
The world, your thoughts.
Well said for sure,
Hollywood loves perpetuating this.
Chauvin, along with some of our friends and reporters, regular and known to all of you. Joyce Vance is with us. Carmen Best joins us. And I want to add to our conversation MSNBC political analyst and former prosecutor, the former Senator Claire McCaskill. Claire, a former prosecutor texted this to me. The jury already understands that Mr. Floyd was prone, cuffed behind his back, and lost consciousness. They also now understand, thanks to the chief, that Chauvin violated MPD policy. Seems like a good day for the prosecution.
Yeah, and the defense attorney does what defense attorneys do, which is trying to make something out of nothing. You know, the bottom line is this man was handcuffed and had 3 police officers on top of him. Handcuffed with 3 police officers on top of him, plus another officer standing by monitoring the crowd. There is nothing in that situation that presented a threat, and 9 minutes is an eternity. As I said the other day, honestly, all I think the prosecutor needs to do is stand up in front of the jury and stand there quietly for 9 minutes, because that's an eternity. And that's the problem these defense lawyers have. And frankly, I don't think that defense lawyer, Joyce, I think will agree with me, having been in a courtroom like that, having been in cross-examinations like that, you know, the prosecutor, the entire time the defense lawyer was crossing the chief of police, the prosecutor was probably saying, keep going, because you're not making any progress. All you're doing is the jury is thinking to themselves, well, wait a minute. What you're saying isn't true. There was no danger from the crowd. There was no danger from this man. So sometimes, in an effort to make a point, you make the opposite point.
Yep. Well, and I don't know, Joyce, if this applies in courtrooms, but certainly in politics when you're in a hole, stop digging. And it seemed like every time the defense attorney stood up to try to, it seems that their strategy is to try to create in a juror's mind a belief system that suggests that in the heat of the moment you can do anything. But this was almost a quarter of an hour. There was no heat of the moment anything that's being scrutinized here. I mean, if it were heat of the moment, maybe you're back in the car. But what is so clear from all of this eyewitness footage and from all of the testimony of people that had nothing else in common other than they happened on this spot and watched Derek Chauvin take the life out of George Floyd was that they all came to the same assessment about what happened that day. What is sort of the history of defense attorneys like this one having success with a strategy like what he's trying to deploy?
One measure of how effective a cross-examination is how much work the prosecutors have to do with the witness on redirect. And so you'll notice, confirming Claire's assessment of the situation, prosecutors had very little redirect to do, because most of what Mr. Nelson spent his time doing was asking hypothetical questions about situations that was not the situation that was presented with George Floyd. You know, isn't it technically possible that X could happen? Well, sure, but that's not what happened on the day that we're looking at. So it was a very ineffective cross-examination.
And Carmen, I keep thinking of this extraordinary position the chief is in. And for the defense attorney to say, hypothetically, if it were a shootout, I mean, the point is it wasn't. And there were 4 guns drawn on George Floyd as he was unarmed in a car. I mean, even his hypotheticals didn't seem to advance whatever his strategy is.
Exactly, and I'm sure the chief, in the back of his mind, was thinking what everyone here is saying. What does that have to do with anything? You know, why am I even being asked these questions? So kudos to him for remaining calm and composed and just answering the question, as ridiculous as some of them did seem at the time. You know, a shootout and freezing a scene. What does that have to do with Derek Chauvin placing his knee on George Floyd's neck for 9 minutes? And so looking out, he mentioned looking out at the crowd and the danger of the crowd. There were 4 cops there, and the crowd was merely trying to get them to help Mr. Floyd. So it seemed rather ridiculous. I'm sure the chief was thinking the same thing, although he remained professional as he would and answered the questions accordingly.
And our community response teams and Foot Patrol. And then I went to the assault unit to do investigations, and then violent criminal investigation team, which was primarily investigating shootings, and then cold case homicide and homicide detective. I was then promoted in December 2019 to the rank of lieutenant. And I should say during that time, I led the SWAT crisis negotiator team for 5 out of the 7 years. When I became a lieutenant, I was assigned to the training division to create leadership and professional development programs for the department. And then I took on the field training officer program. I was promoted to commander of training in April 14th, 2019, where I oversaw the police athletic lead, police explorers, community service officers, the academy, police academies, the in-service training.
Contribution. According to the Times, the Trump campaign internally called it a money bomb, a tactic that experts say is intentionally designed to be easily overlooked. When supporters contributed online, a yellow box.
As a person who was in command of the training center, are you familiar with the basic curriculum that was offered at that center during the time period you oversaw the operations?
I was.
And were you also familiar with the various staff and components who provided training at that center?
Yes.
Before we get into a more thorough description of the training center, I need to ask if you're familiar with an individual by the name of Derek Chauvin.
I am.
How are you familiar with that person?
When we worked on the same shift, we were community service officers together.
Back prior to becoming a police officer?
Correct.
So you've known this person for approximately how long?
Almost 20 years.
Do you recognize Derek Chauvin in the courtroom today?
I do.
Would you please point to him and describe what he's wearing?
I was sitting over there in a navy blue suit.
May the record reflect the witnesses identified the defendant?
It will.
You and the defendant have worked for the Minneapolis Police Department contemporaneously for nearly 20 years?
Correct.
When you came into the police department, did you go through academy training?
I did.
Describe that process.
It was a 16-week police academy that we went through. Everything from, we learned policy, procedure, investigations, defensive tactics, use of force. We did a lot of scenarios at the end that we had to pass. So it was just a wide curriculum of things, report writing, basically anything that pertained to the job.
And after completing the classroom and practical portion of the academy, when you took it, what was the next step?
Sorry?
What was the next step after completing the practical exercises at the academy and the classroom training?
Oh, so it's a field training program, approximately 5 to 6 months long, that you would ride with a field training officer.
And then after you completed that, you were able to get your first assignment?
Correct.
So I'd like you to please describe first generally the training center. Where is it located within Minneapolis?
Sure. So it's our training center is a former elementary school that's located on the north side of Minneapolis, and it's just several classrooms that we use for training.
It's really that simple, testing and technology and bringing those two things together.
So how quickly do you get those results?
Job at Indeed.com/home.
Are you man?
Commander level, or is supervised at the commander level?
It is.
Can you then describe, currently, or at least at the time, say 2020, when you were overseeing it, how is it staffed, or the different positions at the training center?
So there's multiple units out of the Special Operations Center, is the training facility. For the training, we had full-time instructors, our use of force instructors, our patrol operations, our medical support team, our civilian support staff. We have 2 civilian support staff members. I don't know if you want me to go through the rank structure, but...
I do. How many lieutenants were under you?
At the time, there was 3 lieutenants.
In what areas?
So one oversaw pre-service, so your academies, and then another one oversaw the use of force program and our range. And then the other one oversaw our leadership professional development programs and assessment center type of things. We each had an individual kind of specialty things that they oversaw.
And who is the lieutenant over the defensive tactics training?
At the time was Lieutenant John Mersil. Lieutenant Johnny Mersil.
What happens during pre-service training now?
So pre-service is our police academies. We have two different types of police academies, a recruit and a cadet program. So they will, currently it's changed a little bit since last year, but the time I was a commander, it was 18 and 19-week police academy that they would go through, that they had to pass before they could enter into their field training officer program. So they endure a lot of use of force and defensive tactics. They train on investigations. They do
To our viewers here in the United States and around the world, I'm Wolf Blitzer in the Situation Room. The second week of the Derek Chauvin murder trial is now underway. We just heard from perhaps the highest profile witness yet, the Minneapolis police chief, Madera Arredondo, who fired the officer Chauvin soon after George Floyd's death. During several hours of testimony, the chief told the court that Chauvin absolutely violated his department's neck restraint policy during the arrest and said Chauvin's use of force was not part of the training. We also heard very important analysis from the emergency room physician who actually treated Floyd at the hospital. The doctor refuted claims from the defense team that Floyd died of a drug overdose, instead agreeing with the prosecution that he was most likely killed by a lack of oxygen. We're going to go back to the trial right now. On the stand right now is Commander Katie Blackwell of the Minneapolis Police Department. She's being questioned by the prosecution. Let's listen to her.
And Minneapolis Police Departmental policy, is that right?
Correct.
For in-service. Whereas the academy, they're going to go through the same, some of the same concepts and materials, but in a more extended way.
Yes.
Right. Now, you've also mentioned a field training program. In order to have the field training program work, you have field training officers. Is that right?
Correct.
And sometimes, the field training officers need to be aware of what the people in pre-service are doing as far as what they're learning in defensive tactics. Is that right?
Yes.
And so is it true that sometimes field training officers will receive instruction in defensive tactics, for example, just the same as someone in pre-service training?
Correct.
And what is the purpose of making sure that the field training officers are aware of what the training is in pre-service?
So there's consistency of how we grade and how we evaluate recruit officers on the street.
And was the defendant a field training officer?
He was.
Do you know how long he was a field training officer?
I do not know off the top of my head.
Did you select him as a field training officer?
I did.
Now, you mentioned a variety of different courses that are taken and training that's provided at the Workforce Center. Is it important to keep records of that training?
It's very important.
And why is that?
Because Minnesota Post Board, which is our peace officer standards and training, require us to complete so much training each year. Part of that is the 48 hours of continuing education over the course of 3 years. And with that training has to be annual use of force, weapons qualifications, mental health crises, procedural justice. So a third of that training, 16 hours roughly out of that 48 hours, has to be in compliance with the Minnesota Post Board. And so keeping those records are critical to make sure we can, when we bring them to Post Board, they can do an audit on them.
And you rely on those records in order to, in fact, make these reportings to the post boards that you have qualified officers on your staff. Is that right?
Correct.
They're kept in the ordinary course of your business, I guess, in the police department?
They are.
This time I'd like to show the witness only.
Before the draw.
All right, Inspector, you take a look at Exhibit 203, and I'll ask you to rotate through some of the pages so the witness can examine. You familiar with these records?
I am.
How are you familiar with them?
So these are training records that we track in our workforce director system. We maintain these records. Each officer has to sign in at training, usually in the morning and the afternoon. And then our civilian coordinator will upload these into the officer's file so we can keep track of the training, or if somebody didn't make the training, who needs to make it up. And it's in-service training and any additional training that they had on duty.
And I'd like you to go to the back page to show the last page of the witness. All right, and you see that this particular workforce record goes back to 2003. Why is that?
That's when workforce director started, I believe.
Prior to that, there was some different system?
This paper
system. And how long are those records retained?
So, in workforce director or in our...
How long does MPD retain the training records pre-workforce director?
So the city retains records for 7 years. So once we have them, we'll keep this in our workforce director. Some training syllabuses and itineraries are put on an M drive. Paper copies are generally archived at some point. They're brought down to a central location within the city.
But for 7 years?
Correct.
Okay. So these are the records that we have available for this particular individual, going back to 2003, is that
yes.
right? Okay. I'm sorry, is Exhibit 203 the defendant's training records? Exhibit 203, is this the
yes.
the training records of the defendant?
Yes, it is.
I'll offer Exhibit 203.
And 203 you received?
Permission to publish. And so I'd like to just, if you could scroll up and highlight this first record entry here. You can see these records are organized in a way that just generally labels the course, and it gives various dates, and then there's a start date and an end date for the participant. Is that right?
Correct.
And then a total number of continuing education credits that are logged. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Now I want to back up through these records. If you could bring it out again. If you could slide it down, please. All right, so just for example, we can take a look at what's labeled here in the 2019 annual training, that section there. All right, and so you see with these records, it's listed as a 2019 annual in-service training, and it refers to a phase 3. Right. What is the annual in-service training?
So our annual in-service training usually consists of 3 phases of training. The first phase will have 2 days of in-service training for officers, so approximately 14 to 16 hours from January to roughly April. And then phase 2 will roll into our shotgun qualifications or medical training, depending on the curriculum that year, what's in that. And that's usually kind of the beginning of the summer months and the end of the summer months. And then phase 3 is our fall in-service training. And the same thing, it's usually 2 days of different curriculum that we're mandated to do, or that maybe the chief wants us to do, or that we're trying to do professional development courses.
And so regardless of the specific trainer, if an individual from MPD is taking phase 3 2019 annual in-service training, should they be learning the same thing on that particular day as anyone else in MPD taking phase 3 training?
Yes, they should.
If you could zoom out again, go down to 2018 FTO, next page.
Let me just tell everybody listening, there's no argument here. It wasn't stolen. It was a fair, honest election. And this effort to change election laws now It's just an effort by people who want to be sure they win every future election. That's why you see the response from corporate CEOs.
A likely crusade is revealing about a dimension of conservative politics today. The fight against radical...
And so is this a train-the-trainer program?
Yes, from the FTO coordinator and myself as the FTO lieutenant at the time put on that training where we brought in a variety of different instructors to teach at that class.
And what is taught at FTO training?
So that was a almost 40-hour course, and we taught, there was a primary emphasis on leadership, the critical decision-making model, effective role, or it's a recruit observation, performance evaluation report really. So the FTOs are taught the FTO manual, and then they're giving tips on train the adult learner. And we do some scenarios in there where they debrief using the critical decision-making model. They had defensive tactics. They had a component of human resources that came in to explain what the duties and other jobs are as a field training officer. It's basically, we were trying to make sure that they understood what the recruits were being taught because they were going to evaluate them out there. And they're the closest thing to a supervisor that young recruit officer has.
And if I understood your prior testimony, defensive tactics and use of force is something that's trained every year during the regular in-service, is that right?
Correct.
So, for example, in 2018, the defendant would have been instructed in defensive tactics and proper use of force at least twice, right? Once during this 2018 FTO training program and once during the regular in-service.
Correct.
And if we can, I'd like to at this time, just to the witness, display Exhibit 275. In Exhibit 275, does that appear to be handwritten records, like a sign-in roster for a particular course?
It is.
The particular course includes patrol ops, and there's a parenthesis as taught in the academy, and defensive tactics as taught in the academy. Is that right?
Correct.
And the second name on this list, does that appear to be the name of the defendant?
It is.
Right, and so does Exhibit 275 indicate that the defendant did receive on November 30, 2018, a block of defensive tactics training as taught in the academy?
Yes.
Offer Exhibit 275.
275 is received.
Permission to publish. And if you could highlight this portion. And you can see the number of training hours here was 8, is that right?
Correct.
And so that would have been divided between patrol ops and defensive tactics as taught in the academy.
Yes.
And again, the purpose is so that the person can be an effective field training officer and know what the trainees or the cadets and recruits are being taught in pre-service. Is that right?
Yes.
If we could go back then to 203. Page 207. Where it says 2018. This one. If you could highlight that, please. Oh. It's up for me. Is it just quit?
Today it is exiting the mobile business. The company says it will manufacture devices until the end of May to meet promised supplies. After that, it promises to continue warranty service for existing users, but the company plans not to add any new cell phone customers after July 31st.
Here you see it says 2018 shotgun and CIT training. Is that right?
Yes.
It's a 7-hour block.
Yes.
Correct. And CIT, what does that stand for?
That is crisis intervention training, so de-escalation and mental health awareness.
You also see there's a training indicated for procedural justice and Narcan training in 2018, correct?
Yes.
And on the crisis intervention training, this one is a fairly short crisis intervention training block, is that right?
Correct. They switched days. So one group would go to qualify with shotguns, and the other group would be in CIT, and they flip-flop after lunch.
But the original crisis intervention training block or model that's taught to MPD officers is much longer than 7 hours, or even splitting 7 hours. Is that right?
Yes, it's 40 hours, and this is just a refresher.
Okay. And so then if you could move to the next page, please. And highlight that portion. The one above it too, where it starts at CIT 2000.
Western South Dakota, wind now becoming more northerly. Out ahead of this, we're just getting in on some more of that warmer air. Places like Sioux Falls, wind coming in from the south. Temperatures tomorrow morning actually starting out fairly mild, even by midnight. Some of us still barely at 60 degrees. We'll begin tomorrow morning in the mid to upper 40s, and then highs will be much cooler tomorrow. Some of us in parts of northwestern Iowa, southwestern Minnesota, barely getting into the low 60s, but then most of us actually...
12? Yes.
In addition to, if you can take that down, please. In addition to the defensive tactics and use of force training, does in-service training require regular medical or combat lifesaver training?
Yes, we generally do a medical component.
Can you just please describe what that training entails?
Sure. So our medical support team consists of a full-time trainer, and they have part-time trainers that are certified EMTs or paramedics. They're also police officers. So they will perform, they'll conduct CPR training, Narcan, tourniquet, chest seals, and just life-saving measures, they cover positional asphyxia. Sometimes they cover excited delirium, opioids, things that relate to our job when we respond to a call, so they can better assess the situation when they get there and be able to render first aid.
Now, you mentioned the term positional asphyxia. You're familiar with what that is?
Yes.
What is your understanding of positional asphyxia?
So positional asphyxia is if you're in a position where you're not able to adequately breathe. Something is interfering with your airway.
And if an individual is in a prone handcuffed position, for example, face down, that could inhibit their ability to breathe.
Yes.
And cause positional asphyxia.
Yes.
And what are officers trained to do or supposed to do to prevent positional asphyxia?
They're supposed to put them on the side recovery position, which is they're going from prone and just putting them on their side or upright position.
How soon are they supposed to do that prior to or after getting a person under control in the prone position?
As soon as possible.
How long have you known about the potential dangers of positional asphyxia?
We were taught positional asphyxia all the way back to my academy.
At the Minneapolis Police Department?
Yes.
Have the dangers of positional asphyxia been known throughout the department, at least as long as you've been employed there?
Correct.
And your employment overlaps with the defendants, is that correct?
Yes.
Century. If you look at that number on housing, what we're talking about is...
Throw Mitt Romney into the mix too?
You know, I have to say I can't count them.
Actual how-to of providing emergency medical care are officers taught their obligations to provide and render emergency assistance when the circumstances arise.
Yes, it's in policy as well as training.
You're familiar with the Minneapolis critical decision-making model?
I am.
And that model, you've seen the circle, we've all seen the circle now a few times, that model is infused throughout different portions of the training materials at MPD, is that right?
It is.
Why is that?
We wanted to ensure the officers, a lot of experienced officers understand that critical decision-making model. The more experience you have, the more you can walk through it. But we found it critical that recruits learn it early on. It was helping them connect the dots better with information they were receiving on the scene and working through that wheel, constantly reassessing, and then using the pillars of procedural justice in the middle. And so we wanted it consistent with our field training officer program to debrief them, the recruits, and then in our in-service so that officers out there could constantly reassess situations when they're on a scene.
You said that the critical decision-making model was used to reassess people who are going through the FTO process?
Yes, in the field training officer program, we had scenarios where we had the field training officer debrief. At the time, we used community service officers as role players, so we had them debrief using that after a scenario.
So going through the steps of taking in information, assessing risk, assessing threats, reassessing, evaluating goals, and then relating that to the pillars of procedural justice. That's something that any field training officer would be required to do with the people that they're evaluating, correct?
Correct.
In your defensive tactics training, you are not only showing or having officers learn, sort of the nuts and bolts of defensive tactics, but also the rules of engagement. Is that right?
Correct.
And those are contained in the Minneapolis Police Departmental policies. Is that right?
Yes.
And the rules, they apply to everyone. They apply to you.
Yes.
They apply to recruits. They apply to cadets. They apply to people on field training and experienced officers as well. Is that right?
Correct.
All right. I'd like to show you what's been received as Exhibit 17. I'm going to ask you, officer, as you look at Exhibit 17, is this a trained technique that's by the Minneapolis Police Department when you were overseeing the training unit?
It is not.
And why not?
Well, use of force according to policy has to be, consistent with MPD training. And what we train are neck restraints, the conscious and unconscious neck restraint. So per policy, a neck restraint is compressing one or both sides of the neck using an arm or leg. But what we train is using one arm or two arm to do a neck restraint.
And how does this differ?
I don't know what kind of improvised position that is. So that's not what we train.
All right. You can take that down. Thank you. I have no further questions.
Okay.
All right, we're waiting. They took a little break. The defense is about to cross-examine. We're told, let's see if the defense does cross-examine Eric Nelson, the defense attorney for Derek Chauvin. They're having a little conference right now. We've just been listening to Inspector Katie Blackwell of the Minneapolis Police Department. She was the commander of the training division. She just made some significant statements suggesting that there was no training at all for Chauvin or any of the other Minneapolis Police Department officers to keep a knee on the neck of someone who's under questioning or a suspect along those lines. That was very significant. Sarah Seidner's out in Minneapolis. She's working the story for us. It was a significant point that the defense attorney, Eric Nelson, presumably during his cross-examination, is going to follow up on.
Absolutely, and he's been doing this over and over again, where he keeps mentioning that there is a policy in place that even if it wasn't trained, even if they didn't do it physically, that it was in the handbook. But you are hearing from witness after witness that that is simply not how they were trained to keep their knee on someone's neck, especially if they're in what's known as the prone position, and that is the position where you're lying on your stomach. They know that that can cause asphyxia, positional asphyxia as they called it, and so you hear that over and over again. But I do want to quickly, if we can, get to the chief, because we heard also from him similar or the same kind of testimony, and he is the prosecution's 21st witness, by the way, to give you just an idea of just how many people are testifying. And so far we have heard from several officers, something you don't see every day. And the chief was very clear that he learned of what happened to George Floyd and his officers' actions in particular, actually from a community member who called him up and said, have you seen this video of them killing George Floyd, talking about the officers? Now, he had not known that earlier. He had not heard that earlier from his own officers. He heard that from a bystander at around midnight, and then he eventually saw that bystander video. He had initially seen the surveillance video, which is very high up. He could only see the backs of the officers, so he didn't think much of it because he couldn't see what they were doing and certainly couldn't hear what they were doing. There was no audio on the surveillance video. But when he saw the bystander video, that was significant, and he made very clear that what he saw his officers doing, particularly what he saw former Officer Derek Chauvin doing, who was an officer, of course, at the time, the most senior officer on the scene then, was absolutely not in concert with the training for the use of force and that move, putting a knee on someone's neck.
You know, and I think they're about to resume. There we see the defense attorney, Eric Nelson. He's back at his desk.
Good afternoon. Just want a few follow-up questions. In terms of any in-service, you see, when we look at the exhibit, you see 2020 defensive tactics in service, and it's worth 8 hours of time. Agreed?
Correct.
Now, in that course of that 8 hours, officers may go through multiple trainings during that 8-hour time, right?
Correct. They rotate through things.
I'm sorry?
They can rotate through different.
Right. So within that 8-hour time frame, they may get a class or an hour-long class on, say, the human factors of force, or they may get an hour-long course on handcuffing techniques. It varies within each of those 8-hour time frames, right?
Correct.
Now, have you maintained a list that shows 2020, these are the classes that occurred during those 8 hours?
We have.
Okay. And have you provided that list to, in response to the search warrant that was executed at the police department?
Yes.
Okay. Now, in terms of the defensive training tactics or any of these continuing education classes, there are other officers that actually train these classes, and multiple officers may appear during that 8-hour time, multiple trainers, right?
Yes, we have part-time trainers.
So there would be maybe one person will teach the human factors of force, someone else may train on crisis intervention. There'll be multiple instructors, right?
Correct.
But a lot of the instructors will use materials from past instructors, or they'll take combinations of things and they'll just represent it in a slightly different format, right?
At times, yes.
Right. And I just, for the record, I want to ask you, you were served, or Minneapolis Police Department was served with a search warrant requesting all of the training materials for the four involved officers in this case, right?
Correct.
And so this would be materials that were from, some materials that were from the police academy, some materials that were from in-service, just a variety of different records, right?
Correct.
Some 30,000 pages, perhaps?
Thousands, yeah.
Okay. I have no further questions.
Any redirect?
No, Your Honor.
Right. Thank you, Inspector. You may
Thank
be excused. Here's the door.
Control.
Trumpy state legislature. So the notion that...
And we have to do it 8:30, but I'm still hoping that we can get started by 9:15, so same arrangement as today. Thank you. Just a reminder, don't talk to anybody about the case, don't read it in the media. Appreciate your patience. Thank you.
So we wrap up another monumental day of testimony. This is day 6 of testimony in the Derek Chauvin trial. We heard from an emergency room physician who tried to help save George Floyd's life. He's also the man who pronounced George Floyd dead. We'll talk about that. Also, Police Chief Daria Arredondo testifying and some huge moments concerning his testimony. Let's welcome back our expert panel. It's the best panel in the business, coming at this from all angles. There's our HLN legal analyst, great criminal defense attorney Joey Jackson's with us. Another HLN legal analyst, civil rights attorney Ariva Martin's with us. Darren Porcher, law enforcement expert, former NYPD lieutenant, trial attorney, defense attorney Misty Maris back with us. Joseph Scott Morgan, he's a professor.
Market cap. Look at the next.
Phase 3 training, but she, of course, is not the only officer, and what makes her significant at this point is that she is the third officer, high-ranking officer, who has testified that the actions of Chauvin, not saying his name yet in this case, but that the actions of former Officer Chauvin were not in conjunction with the way in which they were trained. In other words, he had violated policy. But if you want to hear it more clearly, all you have to do is listen to his ultimate boss, and that is Chief Madera Arredondo. He took the stand. He was very clear. He knew the policy almost encyclopedic. He could recite much of the policy, and then he started reading some of it as they put that up as exhibits, the prosecution. And he was very clear that what he saw that day was absolutely, it was wrong and not in concert with the policies of the department in which his officers were trained.
Once there was no longer any resistance, and clearly when Mr. Floyd was no longer responsive and even motionless, to continue to apply that level of force to a person proned out, handcuffed behind their back, that in no way, shape, or form is anything that is by policy. It's not part of our training, and it is certainly not part of our ethics or our values.
He could not be more clear on that point. And I do want to remind you of what he said almost a year ago when he was live with us on CNN. He talked about the officers involved, talking about them being complicit even if they weren't the officer, Derek Chauvin, who was on the neck of George Floyd. So he has been consistent in what he has said over this past almost 11 months now. And he has been very clear that he was disturbed by what he saw. I think you could tell that when he talked about that night and that he didn't really learn exactly what had happened, that his officers were involved in something like this, even though he saw the surveillance video of Floyd being taken away in the ambulance, but that he learned from a community member who called him, and then a
and then they came closer, so they were arrived.com.
People were afraid I was contagious. I felt gross.
Makes your blood boil, makes your mouth.
He was talking about how he canceled himself because what provoked that whole incident was, I think it was the weatherman who said, you know, mental health.
We gotta take away your tax cuts and target you? I mean, like, what is happening?
But that's...
Nicole, can I just add one? Yeah, sorry.
That it wasn't the knee on the neck, it was his heart condition and the drugs that killed him. Those are the points that the defense needs to hit. Their cross-examination with all of those hypotheticals with the chief, I thought, were very confusing to the jurors. I know Bob made the point that, you know, they were perhaps raising doubts about what reasonableness is, but I look at it from a layperson's perspective, thinking, you're talking about gun battles, you're talking about baseball bats, and you probably lost most of the jurors. I think in this case, the prosecution had another good day. The issue about the knee on the shoulder versus the neck, you know, maybe that goes to don't believe your eyes, but I think it's going to be a very hard sell to convince people that have watched those videotapes that the knee on the neck is what this case is about. Everybody's going to stick with that, and the brief moment that it may have been on the shoulder is not going to be very, I think, consequential at all to this jury pool.
Thank you. You heard her Reva's point of her TV shot that it was breaking up a bit. We'll try and clean that up for you. Bob, give us your thought on the shoulder blade versus neck, because if you're the defense, you're going to go back to that, aren't you?
Absolutely, and I respectfully, these colleagues of mine are awesome, but you got to remember at the end of the day, Mike, the policies and procedures are important, and I understand why the government is doing it, but it is the jury charge that's read at the end of the day that makes a difference. And I see the defense lawyer asking questions that go towards all that, for example, causation with regard to the death. The ER doctor, I respectfully don't think did well. I think he did well for the defense in this case, because he essentially said, I didn't know all those things when I came to those conclusions. I didn't know that there was drugs that were involved in it, that there was a medical condition involved in it. I'm doing the best I can based upon the presentation of the person that comes in an emergent circumstance, and the EMTs never told me any of this stuff. So all of those things he said could lead to the increased level of the high level of carbon dioxide that he had in his body, and all those things that the defense is trying to say could have been the reason, as opposed to the knee on the neck, are the reasons why he could have actually died from something other than the knee on the neck. The only thing that surprised me, Mike, and I'd be interested what our colleagues would think about it, for the life of me, I can't understand. The prosecutors brought out from the doctor that he had handcuff marks on his wrist. Good argument for the prosecutors to make, showing a struggle, showing something there with respect to that. Why didn't the defense attorney say, if in fact it's true, and I believe based on what we've heard so far it is, and you didn't see any injuries, no scrapes, no nothing on the neck. You made no notation of that. Because at the end of the day, Mike, this comes down to not just a knee on the neck, it's the level of force that was on the neck and whether that contributed to the death. And he didn't bring that out, and I was surprised at that.
Good point, sir. Misty, what's your headline here as we wrap up day 6?
I gotta say, Bob Bianchi hit the nail on the head. I was shocked that there was no commentary by the defense on cross about no visible trauma to George Floyd's neck. To me, that was a missed opportunity, and something that he did bring up in his opening statement, that would be evidence we would see. So I agree with Bob on that point. Look, these were some of the most critical witnesses because they speak to the two major issues in this case, state of mind and causation. With each witness, we saw information that's going to be relevant to the legal analysis of these charges. But I gotta say, I think where we can see the defense going, Gene Casares so astutely pointed this out last week. The defense had laid the groundwork for this issue about the exact placement of the knee. Was it on the neck? Was it on the shoulder blade? I think that's going to be more of a theme weaved into the defense narrative as we proceed through this trial.
Absolutely. Let's welcome in Dr. Lawrence Kobylensky. Doctor, we heard from Dr. Bradford Langenfeld, and again, he's the emergency room physician who treated George Floyd, tried to save his life. On one hand, he said the #1 reason for lack of oxygen during this cardiac arrest was asphyxia. Continuing on, the defense gets out of him that fentanyl can suppress the respiratory system as well. Who do you think he works better for, prosecution or defense?
Well, before I answer who he's better for, let me just say this. That with respect to fentanyl, it is well known that fentanyl has a dramatic effect on respiration. It's a drug that was developed in 1960. It's used clinically for analgesia and for anesthesia. But illicitly, it's used for euphoria. And it can decrease respiration, it can decrease heart rate, it can decrease blood pressure, and ultimately it can decrease oxygen levels, and that could lead to coma and eventually death. So fentanyl is a dangerous drug. Of course, Mr. Floyd was tolerant to that level of fentanyl in his body, which was a lethal dosage for a normal person. But he was tolerant, so he could withstand that dosage with not an issue. But it complicates things. Now, with respect to the knee on the neck and no visible trauma to the exterior of the neck, Andrew Baker, the medical examiner, did a deep dissection of the neck and found no trauma to the strap muscles, no hemorrhages on these are muscles, 4 pairs of muscles on the sides of the neck, no bruising, no hemorrhages, no damage to the cartilage in the neck, the cricoid cartilage, the thyroid cartilage. no break of the hyoid bone. Oddly enough, you know, if the layperson looking at somebody with a knee on the neck, you would expect a lot of trauma to the neck. It's not seen. But this is much more complex than just the knee on the neck. There's also a Birkin effect, which was the compression of the back. Mr. Floyd's back was compressed, both with the knee and another officer pressing down on the back. As people are saying, this is a positional compression asphyxia. It's normally you breathe by expansion of the chest cavity. It goes out and up. Mr. Floyd was not able to do that. So this is truly a case where there wasn't enough oxygen, and you know the brain after about 4 or 5 minutes will become irreversibly dead. So it's more complicated than the knee on the neck or the pressure on the back. There's also some internal situations. This coronary artery disease, hypertension, fentanyl, methamphetamine. It's a more complicated case than it may seem. So is it better for the defense or the prosecution? I think overall it's better for the prosecution. It does indicate, or at least to me, the question really is, would Mr. Floyd be alive today if it were not for the actions of former police officer Chauvin?
Yes, and Joseph Scott Morgan, you have said that very thing as well. I want you to comment on what Dr. Kobylensky's saying concerning knee on the neck, and also we've talked a lot and heard a lot about the compression, that you have somebody prone, their chest is basically on pavement, and you're leaning on them, and it's not only Derek Chauvin on the knee, it's Officer King on his back and Officer Lane on his legs. So all that adds up. Do you agree with Dr. Kobylensky's assessment?
Yes, actually I do. And to kind of dovetailing with Dr. Kobylensky, this idea of burking, it's not something that a lot of people hear of outside of our community, but this compression, this pressing down, is certainly significant in this case. I think that something else that's going to be revisited, though, again, and going back to earlier comments, is the fact that he did, in fact, have fentanyl and meth on board. They're going to bring up, again, this idea of speedballing. I can see it coming from a mile away. And at autopsy, we have to understand that they did do an extensive dissection of the neck, but also, you know, Mr. Floyd's lungs were significantly congested and weighty. And this is going to come up. I think the defense is going to talk about this extensively. I think the defense really missed a chance, going back to what my colleague said earlier. Remember, the young doctor in the emergency room is truly the first eyes-on medical expert, if you will, that had control over this, and they did not pursue a line of questioning with him relative to assessment of injury, and that's significant. I think that they really missed a chance here. And one other thing that Joey kind of hinted at earlier today, I could hear the surprise in his voice because it left me shocked. Defense had talked about absorption of fentanyl rectally. And I'm thinking, where in the world was the defense going with this? Because it just kind of got dropped all of a sudden, and we didn't hear anything else about it. What else do they know? And I think that that's something that we're going to find out more as time goes by over the coming days.
All right, we're going to continue to talk about the testimony of the emergency room physician who pronounced George Floyd dead, also tried to save his life, and Police Chief Arredondo's testimony as well. You're watching HLN's comprehensive coverage of the Derek Chauvin trial. Keep it right here.
A 70-plus demographic getting admitted to the hospital. Now it's the 50-somethings getting hit harder, and hospital numbers are rising for those in their 40s, 30s, even 20s. Wolf?
That's so worrisome. Nick Watt in L.A. Thank you very much. Joining us now, Dr. Celine Gonder, an infectious disease specialist and epidemiologist. She's also a CNN medical analyst. Dr. Gonder, thanks for joining us. As you heard, this average of 3 million coronavirus vaccines in the U.S. Every day. Is that enough, you think, to fight off what some are fearing could be a fourth surge of cases? Some experts are warning about that seriously.
Well, I think that the rate at which we're vaccinating will certainly help, especially among the most elderly, those at highest risk for severe complications. But there is a hitch here, which is that we are seeing this B117 variant that was first identified in the UK, spreading rapidly across the country. It's the dominant strain in many parts of the country. It's what's driving this surge, for example, in Michigan. And that strain is more virulent, which means it causes more severe disease, including in younger adults. And what we're seeing in Michigan are 30, 40, and 50-year-olds who are being hospitalized with severe COVID as a result.
Michigan's having a really, really tough time. As these variants spread, Dr. Gondry, do you think the U.S. should consider delaying second doses of coronavirus vaccine simply to allow more people to get a shot more quickly? Dr. Fauci, as you know, he says that would put us in what he describes as in a tenuous zone. What do you think?
I agree with Dr. Fauci on this one. Some countries have opted to delay the second dose, the UK, Canada, Germany, but we know a couple things for sure. You're much better protected against hospitalization after 2 doses of the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines, and your antibody levels...
They will be coming in from the north to northeast. Wind speeds between 15 and 25 miles an hour. This continues all the way into Wednesday, by the way. So another week where it's looking like we're going to be dealing with multiple breezy days in a row. We'll find out some of these showers and thunderstorms on Futurecast for tonight. We'll be seeing some of them popping up in the southeastern portions of the area, stretching into Minnesota. But then, heading into Tuesday, more of these showers and on and off again, thunderstorms throughout the day. Western South Dakota looking at some snowfall in the hills, at least at this point, for tomorrow. Moderate, heavy at times, this rainfall making its way into the eastern portions of the viewing area, and this will continue into Wednesday, basically right along Interstate 29. The risk for severe weather tomorrow, we have a slight risk. That's that shade of yellow you see on your screen in Minnesota.
Learn more at...
First, in response to Kelly's question earlier, he reiterated the U.S.'s strong support for Jordan and for King Abdullah as a strong ally. Now, the reports about the arrest of the deposed Crown Prince and 20 others are now 24 hours old. Has the President made any calls to the King and Amman reiterating that support?
I don't have any calls to read out. What I tried to convey to Kelly was that those calls or those engagements would likely happen out of the State Department at this point in time.
All right. The other thing on the infrastructure package, there is a private memo that's being circulated in the business community and to some Republican senators that said that the $2.25 trillion price tag is $1 trillion off, and that there's many things in there that were omitted in the initial discussion of the bill, notably the $300 billion energy tax credit, the $100 billion for the Green Bank, and that these things would add $1 trillion to it. This is being circulated on the Hill. Do you have any response to the charge that the President lowballed the price tag on the infrastructure bill?
Sounds mysterious, the memo, the secret memo. Are you saying, just so I understand your question, are you saying there are things the President didn't put in his proposal people think he's going to add to his proposal?
No, there's things there that somebody went through it or is claiming to have gone through it and added it up and came up with $1 trillion more than the President listed as the price tag. So it is actually $3.25 trillion as opposed to...
We laid out very specifically each component of the package and how much we're proposing. So I would encourage you all to get your calculators out and charge that up and see how it compares to the secret memo. Oh wait, go ahead in the back and then we can come back around to the front.
Of Intergovernmental Affairs and the Gender Policy Council have all convened.
ED.com.
Santa, I didn't expect to see this.
Light and so small.
But it's up until that time.
That is correct.
And so the knee of the defendant was on Mr. Floyd's neck up until the time you just pointed out.
Yes, when I viewed that video portion, that is the first time that I've seen the knee of the defendant on the shoulder blade area.
So there's the back and forth. Joey, does the prosecution win that? Conceding maybe the knee was on the neck for 9 minutes, the last 30 seconds it's on the shoulder. Still win the point, don't they?
Yeah, I think they do, and I really do think and believe that this is a consciousness of guilt issue. Mark my words. Look, the fact is that you don't move your knee from the neck until the emergency medical technicians arrive. Well, why didn't you do that? And remember this also, Mike. These questions are setting up something we call closing argument. That's where you're lowering the boom. That's where you're making your argument to the jury. Now, quick point. The fact is that if the knee were on the shoulder blade at an earlier time, it would appear to me that the defense would be pointing that out in the cross-examination, right? Not the last 30 seconds. He'd say, well, let me pull it up a little earlier, would have said the defense attorney. Do you see the knee on the neck then, sir? Is it on the shoulder blade? We could agree it's there. No mention of confirmation bias or camera bias or whatever he was talking about. So the fact is, I'm led to believe that that knee slid off the neck onto the shoulder blade later in time when the emergency text came. And if the knee went to the shoulder blade at that time, that's an indication to me that he knew it shouldn't have been on the neck, knew the EMTs were there, thought he should have removed it, and knew it was wrong in the first place. And so I think that, you know, at the end of the day, it's a compelling point for the prosecution.
All right. Bob Bianchi, though the defense will try and take advantage of that admission by the chief, how will they do that?
They're going to basically say that this is a misconception. Everybody jumped to conclusions. Everybody originally thought that Derek Chauvin's hand was in his pocket. That turns out not to be accurate. Here's another thing that turns out not to be accurate. But in the end, Mike, I agree with Joey that it's about the end game, and it's not just about the summation, because at the end they have to prove for that second-degree murder that there was an intent to commit an assault as opposed to an intent to do something else, like restrain him. It may have been bad, it may have been horrible, but in order to get to that second-degree felony murderers thing, you have to prove it was his intent to commit an injury. And lastly, Mike, the law for deadly force that's read to them, not the policies and procedures, they don't count. It's the law that the legislature put. That's what he's being held accountable for, says it has to be his purpose, that he has to purposely try to do something to cause serious bodily injury resulting in death. And what the defense is going to say is that wasn't his purpose at all. In fact, some of the time his knee wasn't even on that neck. It's everybody jumping to conclusions, and it doesn't fit the law, and therefore he's not guilty. And if they can't prove causation, like the doctor just testified to, and Joseph Scott Morgan, if there's going to be an issue where it's a debate, maybe this, maybe that, that's reasonable doubt. And if that jury can't come to cause and manner of death, it is an acquittal. But if it's not, if they get to that juror of one, Mike, like I say, they don't like the idea that the crime was being committed. They don't like the idea that 2 kinds of drugs were in the system. They don't like the idea that there was resisting arrest, and that's why he went on the floor. They don't like the idea that these policies and procedures give a lot of room. Well, it depends, and maybe, and based on the circumstances, you are going to hang a jury on that, in my opinion.
Again, so this is where these arguments could go. We hope we're equipping you, the viewer, as we watch this continue to play out. Another argument made, and this is through the chief's testimony, is sanctity of life. He's talking about responding in compassion, that sanctity of life is of the utmost, that you want your officers to go home and those you arrest and potential suspects too as well. So let's listen to that. We'll get Darren's take coming out.
While awaiting EMS, MPD employees assisting an individual having an acute medical crisis shall provide any necessary first aid consistent with our MP training as soon as practical.
And so then that presumes, of course, they're waiting for EMS or waiting for some kind of emergency services. Is that right?
That is correct.
So would it be fair to say that this policy then is in 2 parts? The officer has to request EMS or an ambulance, correct?
Yes.
And while waiting for the ambulance, they have to provide, they're required to provide, what medical training and skills they have to attempt to save the person.
That is correct.
And Darren, that's a huge point. I think it's a simple one for someone on the jury. We've seen body cam footage where an officer cannot find a pulse, yet there's no care rendered. Huge point.
Absolutely, Mike, you hit it spot on. We spoke to this earlier when Officer Chauvin had his knee on top of George Floyd. We had another officer that attempted to take his pulse and found that there was no pulse reading. Former Officer Chauvin's response to that was EMS has already been activated. However, there was no introduction of medical aid to try to assist or revive him. And so we go back to what the emergency room doctor stated. Had CPR been performed in the field, we had a greater chance of George Floyd living. But based on former Officer Chauvin or any of the other officers for that matter not performing CPR, it subsequently led to a tighter window, or I should say a smaller window, which prohibited or made it unable for the emergency room staff to revive George Floyd as a result. So we see, apologies, go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, no, forgive me for interrupting. I just want to get Areva in. And really, that point, Areva wrapped up a 5-minute ending for the chief on direct, where he really brought all the points that this was not de-escalation, that the hold on the neck was not light and moderate as policy would have it, that this force was not reasonable. All those points added up pretty tightly at the end of his direct. Don't you agree?
Absolutely, Mike. I think the chief did an outstanding job. I think Gene made the point earlier that this isn't just any chief. This is the chief of police for those jurors. So this is someone that they have a great deal of respect for, and they may not have been listening to his testimony early on as he was laying the foundation for his background and his training, but I can bet you that they were listening very closely as he talked about those key points in this case, that being the unreasonableness of the conduct of this former officer. And I want to go back to this point Bob made about the argument that we can expect from the defense attorney about the knee not being on the neck but being on the shoulder. We also have to keep in mind jurors get offended when lawyers make arguments that are counterintuitive or that just lack common sense. So I can also see a very powerful argument being made by the prosecution. Look, you heard on the body cam video, Chauvin lied by omission to his supervisor when he called and said George Floyd was acting crazy. He didn't tell him that he had kneeled on his neck for 9 minutes and 29 seconds. You saw those bystanders. Nobody was screaming, get your knee off his shoulder. They were saying, get your knee off his neck. You've watched body cam video, you've watched video by bystanders, and there is no video other than that one little short clip that shows the knee on the shoulder. So that argument can backfire on the defense, cause those jurors to be highly offended, and to say, look, we saw what we saw, and what we saw was George Floyd being killed by Chauvin.
All right, again, passionate arguments made by our panel as we wrap up day 6 in the Derek Chauvin trial. More expert analysis and a recap coming up. Keep it right here. You're watching HLN.
4 years, experts believe a storage facility has slowly been built up for Poseidon torpedo.
Russia has had its eye on being the Arctic power for years and is now moving to make that happen. Yes, this is its coastline, for sure, but US officials have expressed concerns to me that this build-up is not just about protecting, it's also about projecting power across the ice, even towards the North Pole.
There are new resources to exploit under the ice, yes, but Russia released this video in January of the first time a freighter got through the ice in the east in the thick winter to sell a new trade route along its northern coast. It's a possible moneymaker for the Kremlin, cutting the current journey time from Asia to Europe through the Suez Canal nearly in half. US officials voiced,
which is a great
things that it's cost me. What have you done with the international community? So there is
15th for legislative business. Speaker Pelosi.
Happy and triumphant existence. Live life Shay's way, with a commitment to listen, with dedication to family, and with endless and boundless love. We will be right back.
At the UPS.
It's easy for any pitcher to sit in the dugout for that length of time. He's sitting there for 10, 20 minutes a couple of these innings, and it's easy to get cold, it's easy to lose focus and feel for what you're doing. And he was able to stay locked in and pitch. And where he was after
5 miles an hour, even stronger, bringing in some cooler air. Then tomorrow, it is going to be cloudy. It is going to be cooler, highs only in the 50s. And with those clouds, we're going to see more rain and thunderstorms, especially
outcome. Approximately 10 to 15% decrease in survival for every minute that CPR is not administered.
By that testimony, Floyd's survivability would have decreased by roughly 50%. Prosecutors say Chauvin continued to kneel on Floyd's neck for nearly 4 minutes after he appeared to lose consciousness. The doctor told prosecutors his leading theory on Floyd's cause of death was cardiac arrest by oxygen deficiency, or asphyxia. The defense has pointed to drugs found in Floyd's system as the primary cause of death.
There are many things that cause hypoxia that would still be considered asphyxiation. Agreed?
Correct.
Specifically fentanyl?
That's correct.
How about methamphetamine?
It can.
Now, the last witness called today was a commander of the training division for the Minneapolis Police Department. And when she was shown a picture of Chauvin kneeling on George Floyd's neck, here's how she responded.
I don't know what kind of improvised position that is. So that's not what we train.
Right.
And in court itself, every day there's a spot reserved each for a member of the Floyd family and for someone from the Chauvin camp. In court today was one of the Floyd brothers, Terrence, who actually said he was surprised at how clear Minneapolis police policy seemed to be on this. Meanwhile, in the Chauvin camp, deputies actually removed the chair reserved for a representative from his camp, saying, we'll put it back if someone actually shows up. Court will be back tomorrow morning with a brand new witness.
Yeah, lots of new developments today. Omar, stay with us. I also want to bring in CNN political commentator Bakari Sellers, who himself is a lawyer, along with Natalie Jackson, a former co-counsel for the families of Trayvon Martin, Breonna Taylor, and others. Also with us, Cheryl Dorsey, a retired LAPD sergeant, author of the book Black and Blue. Sergeant Dorsey, the Minneapolis police chief, testified very bluntly that Chauvin's actions were in no way, shape, or form, his words, part of their policy or training, and certainly not part of what he described as our ethics or values. How powerful do you believe that testimony was?
Today was the case for the murder city. What we saw today was the policy and procedures being reviewed. We also heard from the police talking about causation. And I would just say today was it really was an outline of the case for murder 2 in this case.
Well, Sergeant Dorsey, what do you think?
Well, I think it's going to be very difficult to argue against a sergeant, a lieutenant, a commander, and ultimately the police chief. They're clear on their policies and procedures, and none of what we saw was taught. And so what the defense is going to ultimately try to do is speak to what was in Chauvin's mind, because understand it's very difficult to argue what's in someone's head.
Let me go back to Omar for a second before I go to Bakari. Omar, how does the community there in Minneapolis view Chief Arredondo? How much weight does his testimony carry? He's been the police chief there, for 3 years?
It carries a lot of weight because a lot of what people are looking for is sort of that traditional blue wall of silence that you might see in departments or what you've seen in police historically, that police won't testify against police, they won't rat out police officers. And what you're seeing now is, at the very least, a symbolic move of the current police chief saying that what Derek Chauvin did is not representative of who we are as Minneapolis police officers. So that rings true in the community. And on top of that, he has stayed consistent over this. You remember, he fired Chauvin and these officers within 48 hours of this happening back in May. And weeks later in June, he released that letter to the community saying, we believe what Derek Chauvin did was murder, and make no mistakes about it, it does not fall within our ethics and values as Minneapolis police officers. And you heard some of that play out over the course of court today, no doubt hoping to make an impact on many in the community who are watching.
You know, Bakari, we also heard very blunt testimony from the former commander of the police training division there in Minneapolis, the Inspector Katie Blackwell, someone who's known Derek Chauvin for some 20 years, and she said Chauvin's knee on Floyd's neck is not what we train. Her direct words, not what we train. How far do you think that might go with the jurors?
So I think today was the strongest day for the prosecution that we've seen. I mean, last week was very emotional. You had a lot of young people testify. You had our heartstrings being pulled. But today really went to the heart. And I don't see how you get around, if you're a defense attorney like I am, how you get around a guilty verdict on something. I mean, what we saw today was he was completely reckless, negligent, and the question will be whether or not he was intentional or not in his acts. Because it's also rare, Wolf, and I want people to understand this. I mean, I'm sitting with some women who've actually done this before in particular, but it's very rare to see law enforcement come in a courtroom one after one after one and actually testify against another law enforcement officer. I mean, today was a brilliant day and a very good day for this country, because what we saw was law enforcement quite clearly coming out and saying, what this gentleman did was wrong. These are our policies extremely clearly, and this is how he violated these policies. And so what we saw today is something that we don't see often in cases like this, and I think that's going to be the difference between a guilty and not guilty verdict. We still have a long way to go, and I'm sure the criminal defense attorney is going to be trying to muddy the water a little bit and say that drugs played a role in his death. But today is going to be a very difficult hurdle for them to overcome, and I don't see how you get around a guilty verdict on at least one of those charges when they go back to the jury room.
Of those 3 charges, you know, Natalie, we also heard...
Favors the ball at 400.
Many have been sick, lost loved ones, tens of thousands.
And on the full committee as well.
People have talked about the
country is federally owned. So what does that mean? State and locals run infrastructure in this country. So when the federal government writes a big check, what state and local governments do is they take money that was
using oxygen, that simply asphyxia was not necessarily the work of Mr. Chauvin and his conduct on that day. But again, we are seeing the causation question come up, and then we're seeing this rebuttal of the affirmative defense over and over from the prosecution.
Yeah, Fatima, your view on the same issue, because it's important to say if somebody is strangled to death via knee, if they're asphyxiated, and that's where the jury comes down, that's about as simple as you can get. It could be like a bullet through the brain. You say, okay, this is what happened. If you get 1 or 2 jurors saying, well, I don't know, I'm confused, there's doubt, what if this was related to this other stuff? I heard a witness say, well, you can be asphyxiated by drug use, so that could be a contributing cause. Your view of all this, Fatima?
Well, I also think it's important to recognize that this is a sort of typical approach. The typical approach is to paint him as someone who has engaged in bad conduct. And so if you would rather see him as someone who is engaged in drug use, someone who had other things, and not point to the 9.5 minutes of effectively choking him to death, that's what they're trying to pull out in this moment. And I think if you go back to the affirmative testimony, it is hard to see. His original testimony was that it was basically asphyxiation.
Fatima and Melissa, thanks to both of you for kicking us off here tonight.
Sustain is leading. Rephrase.
Did you see them provide any medical attention?
I did not.
And based on these observations, do you have an opinion as to whether the defendant violated MPD Departmental Policy 7-350 by failing to render aid to Mr. Floyd?
I agree.
Damning testimony there from the chief, but later in cross-examination, the chief admitted that it looked like Derek Chauvin's knee may have been on George Floyd's shoulder at one point and not the neck. Can the defense take advantage? That huge moment is on the way.
Not everybody wants the same thing. That's why I go with Liberty Mutual. They customize my car insurance so I only pay for what I need. Because I do things a bit differently. What, teddy bears? What, teddy bears here?
Only pay for what you need.
80s like today.
Shoot, all right. Thanks, Jay. In a little more than a month, this year's senior class will be graduating from high school. And boy, what a year it has been. For the class of 2021, attending school for the past year during the pandemic has had plenty of ups and downs and some missed opportunities. Hear from 3 graduating seniors on tonight's Eye on KELOLAND at 10.
The Minnesota State Fairgrounds will soon be attracting a different kind of crowd. We'll let you know what FEMA plans to do there.
The CDC is seeing an increase in COVID-19 cases in specific age groups. All of today's health headlines are coming up next.
Boom, across the country.
That probably have ever coached.
He is one of the most unique.
But what if you could sell your house?
On KSFY, a major development in COVID-19 vaccinations here in South Dakota as the number of eligible people dramatically expanded today. Continuing coverage at 6 on Dakota News Now.
Closed captioning.
Deeply insulting to describe what we did is inhumane. We ended the process of human smuggling and trafficking that destroys lives, that leads to sexual assault, that leads to physical assault, and that finances the cartels, creating this cycle of violence and poverty. If the cartels had a vote, they would vote for, unanimously, the border policies in place under Biden. It
suggests to me that the congressman from Florida has learned a wee bit too much from Donald Trump. He's of course innocent until proven guilty, and no one should rush to judgment. And so in that sense, I agree with that one point in his article. But having said that, precisely because he's innocent until proven guilty, what in the world is he doing talking to Tucker Carlson and writing this ridiculous op-ed? I mean, at one point he says the girl doesn't exist. Then he says Tucker Carlson met her. Another point, he says these allegations are about one girl, but then later he says it's about multiple. I mean, we're not exactly dealing with Albert Einstein here, and so my strong advice to him, my professional advice, is to shut up. I mean, and there's been this demonstrates there's been a culture of impunity around Republicans over the last several years. They thought they could get away with anything. But there's a real Justice Department now, and they can't. And Ari, you mentioned that article that he wrote, the op-ed in his defense, and the two words you don't see anywhere in that article are Bill Barr. This investigation was opened by Bill Barr. He thought it was credible enough to continue the investigation. This is not a guy who was shy about shutting down investigations against Republicans. Bill Barr did repeatedly, but even he kept this thing going. And now it's under Merrick Garland's control. And I don't think there's anyone more fair or honest than Merrick Garland.
Yeah, and as you say, it really does have that Trumpian echo, and it's, I suppose, a bit of a testing ground for how the system, by which I mean the Justice Department, but also everything else around the institution, deals with these things, because he's doing a witch hunt playbook. Reading again, as you mentioned from the op-ed, he says, quote, "I'm sure some partisan crooks in Merrick Garland's Justice Department want to pervert the truth and the law to go after me. I will not be intimidated or extorted." Again, as you say, and we've reported, he's legally innocent. He has not been charged. But if he thinks the facts will acquit him, then obviously you can move forward in that standing. He sounds more like someone who's girding for a bigger battle with the Garland Justice Department. If he thought they were going to say, hey, we didn't find anything here, we looked into it, he wouldn't need to criticize them. And so what do you make of where the Republican Party has to line up here, given the Trumpian playbook that's being trotted out again?
Or you refer to this having a Trumpian echo, and that's true in a sense, but it's also not true in a sense. I mean, even Donald Trump is not defending Matt Gaetz right now. And Donald Trump is so desperate for attention, he stuffed an entire Twitter thread on the 2020 election into his Easter tweet, or into his Easter statement. So, I think it is pretty remarkable here. And I think it's really hard to attack Merrick Garland. I mean, they can try, but honestly, if I were accused of a crime, the prosecutor I'd want is Merrick Garland. He's balanced, he's fair, he has the respect of every conservative jurist in this nation, every serious conservative jurist. So, this isn't like you can, run the same playbook and the same kind of attack machines. And, the fact is these crimes are serious that he's been charged with. I mean, Section 2423, which involves bringing a minor or traveling for sexual intercourse with a minor, has a punishment of 30 years. And, sometimes the personal is not political, but here I think Gaetz faces a problem because he was the only member of Congress to vote against a bill that bolstered human trafficking investigations. And I don't think you have to be a member of QAnon to connect some dots with that one.
Right?
Yes.
They have to be aware of their surroundings, right? Generally speaking. Being on a busy street versus being in a park, right?
Yes.
Different decisions go into that, right?
Yes.
Knowing that I have other officers that are in place and may be at risk as well, right?
Yes.
So there's lots of, the critical decision-making model is not singular in its application.
That's correct.
Lots of information coming in very rapidly, right?
Yes.
So I'm going to show you first, and I believe by stipulation, or at least without objection, I'm going to play a few minutes, or excuse me, a few seconds of Ms. Frazier's Facebook video. So at this time, I'd offer Exhibit 1018. Permission to publish.
1018 is received. You may publish.
This appears to be sort of that time, that picture that was shown to you earlier, Exhibit 19. This is that general time frame that picture appears to be taken from.
Counsel, yes. I'm sorry. That's the question. Sorry.
Oh, yeah. This appears to be that. The image you were shown on direct examination, that static Exhibit 19, right?
Yes.
Shows Officer Chauvin, shows Mr. Floyd, it shows Officer Top.
Yes.
And it shows the perspective of the Miss Frazier's phone. Chief, are you familiar with the concept of camera perspective bias?
I am not, Counselor.
Okay. Now again, if I may take that down, a stipulation I show that same time frame, Exhibit 1019, that same perspective from Mr. King's body camera, and I offer 1019. 1019.
Any objection? 1019 is received.
Wish to publish, Your Honor. Agree it appears to be the same time frame?
Yes.
All right. Now lastly, Chief, I'm going to show you one last video. We can take this down, Your Honor. I would offer Exhibit 1020, which is a side-by-side of the two.
Any objection?
No objection.
1020 is received.
And permission to publish. Pardon? Oh.
And again, there could be some hail or strong wind gusts. But I mean, like 1 inch hail and 60 mile an hour gusts. This isn't a high-end thunderstorm event, but enough to get your attention, certainly. And a slight risk of severe weather, the yellow patch you see there in southwest Minnesota. All right, here's what it looks like on Futurecast. 10 o'clock tonight, I should just get out of the way of those thunderstorms as they come through southeastern South Dakota. Again, these are the storms I was talking about. They will move east of I-29 into Minnesota and Iowa after midnight tonight. Then there's tomorrow morning. Thunderstorms will be possible, rain and thunderstorms, I should say, mainly north of I-90. Sioux Falls, we might get a little break in the action early in the day tomorrow. Then tomorrow afternoon, watch what happens. We'll see rain and thunderstorms grow. That's these greens and these yellows widespread across the area. And the western part of South Dakota, wet snow will be possible. Of course, the winter storm warning in the Black Hills. Otherwise,
right after this.
The people versus the plan. From you, Cindy.
Wait, what's that?
EV items. The store says it will accept damaged or expired car seats as well.
The last LG mobile phone you bought will likely be the last one you ever buy from them. The South Korean electronics company announcing today it is getting out of the mobile business. The company says it will manufacture devices until the end of May to meet promised supplies. After that, it promises to continue warranty service for existing users. Samsung unveiling a new collaboration with Adidas. The company is releasing a Galaxy Buds Pro Adidas Special Pack. The wireless earphones are packaged in a sneaker box with the classic Stan Smith design. The limited edition pack also comes with a coupon for a new pair of Stan Smith sneakers. Say that 3 times fast. Samsung, there's another S, says only 6,000 will go on sale Wednesday in South Korea. They're going to cost around $250.
A great night to put the headphones on and go for a walk. Phil has one more check of the forecast when we come back.
Dakota News Now.
You're 100% certain? I'm 100% certain of it. And all I can do is cooperate and trust in the process.
And Hunter Biden is saying he did not make a mistake when he accepted a high-paying job on the board of directors of a Ukrainian energy company when the vice president was in charge of that policy.
They got a record $14 million in donations after the first so-called money bomb. The campaign was so desperate, it took the con to very blatant lengths, automatically rolling donors into weekly recurring donations, which ensured that way more MAGA fans would notice, and they did. And they accused their beloved president of overseeing a fraudulent operation, which forced Trump and the RNC to refund over $122 million. You can see there when they started the tactic and how it soared to have these demanded refunds, and it's over 6 times the rate of the Biden campaign. Now, we can take this story in tonight, but what do we have here? Donald Trump announces a big new project, and he touts his own skills for winning and making money. Then he uses the very people who believe in him to take or steal their money. And when the project fails, he runs off, leaving them to have to work to get their money back from him. And some do, others don't. So he still manages to hold on to some money that he took from people who, of course, have far less money than him. If it sounds familiar, almost exhaustingly so, it's literally the playbook for the now infamous Trump University, which, remember, was a business that gave out business advice which went out of business. Embarrassing. And like so many cons, it didn't prey on Donald Trump's critics or his detractors or the journalists he wants to give a hard time. No, it focused squarely on the people who like Trump enough to become his own financial prey.
Covered by Medicare. Ask your doctor for a prescription. You can do it without finger sticks. Learn more at freestylelibre2.us.
Programs to make buying simple.
Support it. Some think it's too small. Frankly, there have been folks who have come out on both sides.
As the bill exists today, it needs to be changed.
Some progressive members of the party say the package itself isn't big enough.
In order for us to realize this inspiring vision, we need to go way higher.
As that debate plays out on Capitol Hill, President Biden is weighing in on another.
I would strongly support them doing that.
The White House says Biden supports the decision by Major League Baseball to move its All-Star game out of Georgia after Republicans in the state passed a new voting law.
That was their decision. They made that decision, and as he stated earlier, he certainly supports that.
Biden has been extremely critical of the new law, calling it a 21st century version of Jim Crow, but faced criticism himself after he falsely claimed the law ends voting hours early.
Can't do that? Come on. Or you're going to close the polling place at 5 o'clock when working people just get off?
The White House acknowledged it doesn't change Election Day voting hours today.
The president does acknowledge that the new law doesn't change Election Day voting hours, right? Well, look, Caitlin, it also doesn't expand them for early voting. It makes early voting shorter. So there are a lot of components of the legislation he is concerned about, and that's what he was expressing.
Now, Wolf, another pushback that we've heard from Republicans is they think raising these tax rates, these corporate tax rates, is going to drive corporations and businesses to leave the U.S. But when President Biden was asked about that earlier today, he pushed back and said there's no evidence of that. And we should note, of course, Wolf, all of this came on the day that his Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen, called for there to be a global corporate tax rate. Of course, whether or not that actually happens is a question that remains to be seen what the answer is going to be.
Wall Street on this day seems to be very, very happy. Record highs for both the NASDAQ, for the S&P 500 as well as the Dow Jones Industrial Average, way up. At least right now, Wall Street very happy. All right, thanks very much for that, Caitlin Collins at the White House. Let's discuss all of this and more with the Transportation Secretary of the United States, Pete Buttigieg. Mr. Secretary, thanks so much for joining us. As you know, the Senate Minority Leader, Mitch McConnell, says President Biden's infrastructure plan would need to be, in his words, completely recrafted to win any Republican votes at all. And Democrat Joe Manchin, as you just heard, he also says the bill needs to be changed. How much is President Biden, Mr. Secretary, willing to compromise?
Well, you know, President Biden cares about a bipartisan approach, and he cares about what members of the Senate and the House and the public think. So I think you'll see a lot of movement. But at the end of the day, there's a clear vision from the president. It's a good vision. It's supported by the American people. It will contribute to the creation of millions of jobs, and we feel great about it. But yes.
Tonight, as older Americans are getting vaccinated, younger Americans are getting infected by coronavirus variants. The race to contain a spring surge. A vaccine record, 4 million doses in just one day. But the CDC says it's young people driving spikes nationwide. The new COVID hotspot, Michigan, where the number of new infections is 5 times higher in less than 2 months. Plus, the new cleaning guidelines to prevent the spread of COVID-19. Derek Chauvin's former boss testifies. The Minneapolis police chief who fired the officer says Chauvin absolutely violated policy by keeping his knee on George Floyd's neck for more than 9 minutes. Plus, the ER doctor on what killed Floyd. Fear of collapse. The danger tonight at a Florida reservoir that could unleash millions of gallons of contaminated water. The state of emergency and evacuation orders. Understaffed, struggling, and in mourning. Capitol Police officers plead for more resources after another deadly attack. Tonight, new details on the suspect who ran down 2 officers and the knife he was carrying. Crisis at the border. We travel to Central America where a mother tells us why she's leaving her 3 children behind. Hundreds of hikers evacuated after lava flows from a volcano in Iceland. And truly, March Madness, the buzzer beaters, and the coach who lost the championship but won the weekend just by being a mom.
This is the CBS Evening News with Norah O'Donnell, reporting from the nation's capital.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us. We are going to begin tonight with new fears the U.S. is at the beginning of a 4th wave of coronavirus infections, this time fueled by young people. Tonight, the head of the CDC says cases are increasing nationwide, caused by the spread of those more contagious variants of the virus, including one first discovered in the United Kingdom. And she says she's especially concerned about students who haven't been vaccinated yet and aren't following social distancing rules. The CDC says it's seeing outbreaks happening around the reopening of schools, especially tied to extracurricular activities and youth sports. The warning tonight: follow the rules until young people can get vaccinated. And while the White House is touting the number of adults who have now gotten at least 1 shot, the president's senior advisor for pandemic response said today the war against COVID is far from over and that Americans can't mistake progress for victory. And
in the next few days, we'll time all of that. Baseball game to open at full capacity. Nearly 40,000 fans in the stands, a lot of folks there skipping masks. And it comes after the Easter holiday and a record number of people traveling over the weekend. 6 million screened at the airports from Thursday to Sunday. That's the highest since this pandemic began. And as cases rise, authorities are taking note of the number of younger people getting this. At least 7 variants are circulating in this country, and that new double mutant variant now identified in California. So the race to vaccinate tonight to try to stay ahead of these variants, a record 4 million doses given in just one 24-hour period over the weekend. And look at the numbers. 103,829,000 have received at least one dose, more than 40% of adults. We're going to unpack it all for you tonight, including that update from the CDC, surfaces versus particles in the air, and ABC's Kaylee Hartung leads us off from Texas.
Tonight in Texas, nearly 40,000 baseball fans filling the stands for the Rangers home opener.
We were going to get opening day last year, but then everything got shut down. So we've been waiting a year for this.
The first team in sports to reopen a stadium at full capacity with masks required. Even the president calling it a mistake.
As long as everybody follows the rules like they're supposed to, we're good.
But many fans not wearing masks. A packed stadium and over the weekend, packed airports. 6 million Americans traveling over the holiday, the busiest weekend of the pandemic. And with rising cases, some experts fear a looming surge.
We're just at the beginning of this surge. We haven't even really begun to see it yet.
Deaths from COVID are climbing across 18 states, and the number of Americans going into hospitals up in 16 states, with a 23% jump in the upper Midwest. The mayor of Detroit with a warning.
If this triples again in another 2 or 3 weeks, we are talking about the kinds of levels we saw last March and April when people were on gurneys in hallways.
44-year-old Tina Catron, a healthy mother of 2, grateful to be back home from Beaumont Hospital in Detroit after getting pneumonia from COVID.
All the thoughts went through my head. You know, what if I don't see my kids again? What if I don't see my husband again?
The CDC seeing more cases in younger adults who are less likely to be vaccinated.
We know that these increases are due in part to more highly transmissible variants, which we are very closely monitoring.
Researchers studying whether a new variant with 2 mutations, also known as the double mutant strain, is more dangerous. It was first seen in India and has now been confirmed in California. And now in a race against the variants, this week 14 states are joining 22 others in opening vaccinations to anyone over 16. Tonight, one family urging everyone to take this seriously. Their 75-year-old mother, Air Force veteran Denise Drews, wanted the vaccine, but got sick before she could get one and did not survive.
What we had been hoping for was finally here, but it wasn't meant to be for her. Everybody's antsy to be back to normal, but for people who have lost a loved one, our normal will never be the same.
That one family offering a bit of a warning there. And Kaylee joined us now from outside that stadium in Arlington, Texas. We can hear the music from the stadium, Kaylee. I think folks are really going to be torn on these images tonight. We all want to get there again. The debate, of course, is how to do it, how soon. And the CDC has been firm on this, suggesting it's too soon for full, packed crowds. And they're out with a new study tonight, actually, that looks at just one bar, for example, that reopened in Illinois and the potential impact one establishment can have on an entire community.
Yeah, David, you see the real ripple effect here. There was one indoor event at a bar that led to 46 infections. One school had to shut down, and the president of a long-term care facility ended up in the hospital. 17 of the people who got sick, they didn't even go to that party. Researchers are pointing to limited mask use there and no consistent physical distancing. David.
All right, Kaylee Hartung from Texas tonight. Kaylee, thank you. We know a lot of your questions at home. Dr. Ashish Jha, Dean of the Brown School of Public Health, back with us again tonight. Dr. Jha, always great to have you with us.
Department policies, including the use of de-escalation techniques, which he did not see in the videos.
That action is not de-escalation. That action goes contrary to what we're taught.
CBS News legal analyst Ricky Kleeman.
What are the implications for a juror when they see the chief of police testifying against someone who used to be an employee?
It cannot possibly be underestimated what influence a chief of police would have on a juror. A juror is a citizen of this county, and they look to this police chief as the person who has the aura of authority.
Arredondo, seen here kneeling in front of Floyd's hearse, fired Chauvin and the 3 other officers who were at the scene. He later released this statement saying, quote, Mr. George Floyd's tragic death was not due to a lack of training. The training was there. He goes on to say that what happened to Mr. Floyd was murder. Earlier, Bradford Langenfeld, the doctor who pronounced Floyd dead at the hospital, took the stand. He says Floyd's cardiac arrest was most likely due to a lack of oxygen.
At the time, based on the information I had, it was more likely than the other possibilities.
And doctor, is there another name for death by oxygen deficiency?
Asphyxia is a commonly understood term.
Defense attorney Eric Nelson took more than an hour to try and pick apart the chief's testimony, showing at the time of the incident it was not against policy to use a knee on the neck as a use of restraint. Nora?
Jamie Yukas, thank you. We're going to turn now to Florida, where tonight there is a frantic effort to prevent a catastrophic flood from a wastewater pond near Tampa. Hundreds have been evacuated. Crews are pumping out millions of gallons of toxic water to relieve pressure at the pond. And CBS's Janet Shamlian has late word on a new setback.
Tonight, a potential second leak in the containment pond that still holds almost 300 million gallons of toxic water from a long-abandoned phosphate plant.
At approximately 2 a.m., an infrared drone identified a signature that could indicate a second breach as the engineering team evacuated the site.
A collapse of the aging reservoir could send a 20-foot wall of wastewater into nearby areas. That's why 30 million gallons of the contaminated water are being pumped every 24 hours into Tampa Bay and other waterways, raising fears it could kill fish and wildlife. Some 300 homes and a nearby prison already under evacuation orders.
It's just such a breach of trust for, for us in the community.
Melissa Fitzsimmons lives on the border of the evacuation zone and is taking no chances.
Thankfully, we have family that live a couple miles down the road, so we kind of brought everything there that we needed to, and then are just preparing, I guess, for the worst.
Phosphate production.
I would say is the end. And things start to normalize again. And I don't think we're too far away from that. And I think you have to give the previous administration, the Trump administration, credit for Operation Warp Speed, for getting the vaccines done, produced so quickly, working with the pharmaceutical companies, Pfizer, Moderna, Johnson & Johnson, all of those, came together in record time. And then you got to give the Biden administration credit for getting it out there. I mean, they've done a good job of getting it distributed. Millions of people are getting shots in the arm every day. And hopefully within a couple of months, anybody who wants one will have gotten one. And I think that's going to give us, that gets us back to normal, I hope at least, in terms of the healthcare crisis. On the economic side, it's coming back. The jobs numbers have been great this past weekend. And if you look at kind of where the economy is, the Congressional Budget Office, for example, which is kind of one of the analysts that we pay attention to, has said that even if the federal government didn't do anything more, and that was before the last stimulus bill passed, that the economy would grow at 3.7% this year. So the economy's coming back. You can see that in the numbers. You can feel it out there as people get out and about.
President Biden also recently announced a $2 trillion infrastructure plan. What were your thoughts when he rolled this out? And do you think there's benefits of it for South Dakotans?
There are always benefits for South Dakotans in infrastructure proposals. I've been involved in a lot of them in the time that I've been in Congress. It's an interest of mine. It's important to our state. Our agriculture is our number one industry. We've got to get our commodities to the marketplace. That means we've got to have roads and bridges and railroads, and we're dependent upon air travel out here. So I'm a big believer in infrastructure investment, and I think there is a path forward that would allow for a bipartisan infrastructure package. I think what the president in his latest proposal has done, however, is lumped a lot of things into infrastructure, into the definition of infrastructure that really don't fit there. He's got housing in there, he's got healthcare in there, he's got daycare in there, he's got schools in there. You can kind of go right down electric vehicles. There's a whole bunch of stuff. Kind of the Green New Deal agenda is included in there. And it's going to be really hard to get bipartisan support for that because, one, it's so big, coming off of a $2 trillion bill that just passed, which was much larger than we thought it should be. And this one, because only about 6% is actually going toward transportation, toward roads and bridges and what we would consider traditionally to be infrastructure, I think it's going to be hard to get bipartisan support for that. So I'm hoping what will happen is that the president will kind of dial back his expectations both in terms of the size and the substance of this and focus literally on what is infrastructure. And I would include in that category broadband. I think broadband is something that we want to get distributed across this country, high-speed internet service. But all those other things that they're lumping in there is a massive expansion of government and financed largely with tax increases, which are going to hit the very businesses that we're asking to go out there and start investing and creating jobs again.
So President Biden has said, and his administration has said, that with the tax increases, he's really focusing on a corporate tax, going from that 21% to 28%. People who are making $400,000 or less, he says, won't be affected. Do you agree with that?
Well, here's the thing about that. I mean, the corporate tax rate, for one, we reduced the corporate tax rate in the 2017 tax bill, and the reason we did is because we had the highest tax rate in the world. And what this does is it pushes us back up, and you add in state taxes on what we call C Corps, and those are kind of your big publicly held companies. It will make us non-competitive in the world. And a lot of the investment that we would like to have seen in the United States was going elsewhere. That's why that rate came down. But here's the other thing, another problem with it. The individual rates, and we talked about people making, under $400,000 or more. A lot of the people who pay taxes at the individual rates are pass-through businesses. We tax pass-through businesses, which are partnerships, S-corps, LLCs. They're organized that way. But farms and ranch, most small business, in fact, 98-99% of the businesses in South Dakota are pass-throughs. So they pay taxes at the individual tax rate. So when they say they're hitting high-income individuals, a lot of those high-income individuals are small businesses. And so those taxes are going to not hit just the big publicly held corporations that the president and the Democrats like to talk about, but a lot of those mom and pop, Main Street family businesses that are organized as pass-throughs and are going to pay taxes at the individual rate.
Okay. Well, we have to take a short break here. Senator John Thune will be joining us with much more after this.
Call now. Guatemalans have been apprehended at the southwest border. In Kabul, Aurora Chokchuk, a single mother of 3 whose house was gutted.
Be at a situation where we will no longer have that risk of that full breach.
But tonight, growing concerns about the environmental impact, especially on Tampa Bay.
If all of this water is pumped in or leaked into the bay,
I'm gonna play my clarinet.
I was gonna play a drum. Drum loud.
From Palmetto, Florida, and Stephanie, bottom line tonight, what are officials up against? I know they spoke earlier today. Do they think they've got the situation under control?
Play band.
Early screening for all.
The American market is way too important to corporate America for them to ignore this. And you can't just be writing pledges and put things up in your office and say that we love and embrace diversity, equity, and inclusion is important to us. You have to live the pledge. Corporate America must live the pledge to its employees. They must live the pledge to African American owned businesses. They must, in fact, find and provide opportunity. And what they have seen now is that many of their employees, much of their market share, are, in fact, made up of people of color, or African Americans in particular, and they've got to do something about it. They have to live that pledge that they have up on the walls and say, we embrace diversity. If you embrace it... Any specific companies come to mind? I mean, the list is too large to go through and say, is there anyone in particular that... I think all of corporate America. I mean, the greatest trade deficit we have in this country is between corporate America and African American market. That is the greatest trade deficit we have in this country. And so let's begin to address that trade deficit, that trade imbalance. That trade imbalance and that trade deficit can be made up by demonstrating, living the pledge, walking the walk, demonstrating that you care, corporate America, and you want to see that the people who are working for you have opportunities, that the people that you're doing business with have opportunities, that there is in fact an equity. The most important of the 3 words is equity in this thing. And why would people spend so much time trying to suppress the black vote, right? The only reason why is because you must be frightened of what in fact that vote would say, right? One person, one vote. That's a very fundamental thing, and I don't think we should do anything of any effort that would suppress that vote.